The night is quiet, except for the faint crackle of a fire and the slow rhythm of breathing from those already asleep. Outside, the wind moves through the grass like the whisper of something ancient, carrying the smell of salt from the sea. Somewhere in the distance, waves break against the shore, but here, in this small Viking settlement, the sound feels far away. You close your eyes, but your mind drifts, not to dreams, but to a time when life was far from peaceful. A time when health and sickness, life and death, could change with the pull of a sword or the sting of an arrow. A time when medicine was not a science as we know it, but a mixture of skill, superstition, and sheer courage. Imagine waking up in that world, a place where there were no hospitals, no trained doctors with white coats, no gentle anesthesia to lull you into painless sleep. In the Viking Age, if you were hurt or sick, your only hope lay in the hands of someone who had learned their craft through experience, often brutal experience. A healer might be the village wise woman, mixing herbs and chanting prayers. Or it could be the man who had pulled arrows from comrades on the battlefield, his hands steady, but his methods questionable. Surgery was done with the tools they had: knives for skinning animals, hammers for shaping metal, needles meant for sails but pushed through flesh instead. And yet, despite the crude tools and the lack of modern understanding, some of them saved lives in ways that even surprise doctors today. But medicine among the Vikings was never just about healing the body. It was wrapped in beliefs in the old Norse gods, in runes and rituals. They believed disease could be caused by angry spirits or by the breaking of sacred oaths. They thought certain plants carried the power of Odin himself, and that a chant could be as powerful as a salve. Some treatments worked, some didn't, and sometimes the cure was as dangerous as the illness. Yet, when the choice was between trying and dying, you would take the risk. Everyone did. Picture a long house filled with the thick smell of burning wood and boiled herbs. Outside, warriors are returning from a raid. Inside, a young man sits on a bench, pale and sweating, clutching his side. The fight was quick, but a spear caught him just under the ribs. The wound is bleeding slow, which is worse than bleeding fast, because it means something deep inside has been torn. The healer moves toward him, not with the clean gloves or sterile instruments we know today, but with a pouch of iron tools blackened from the fire, and a bowl of something that smells sharp and bitter. She speaks low, telling him to bite down on a strip of leather. There will be no mercy in what comes next. If you're imagining this as a nightmare, you're not far off. Without painkillers, every cut, every stitch, every probing of a wound was felt in full. A simple injury could become a death sentence if it became infected, and infection was a constant threat. The Vikings didn't understand bacteria, but they knew enough to try washing wounds with alcohol from mead or ale, and sometimes with water boiled over the fire. In a strange way, some of their habits were closer to modern antiseptic practices than the medicine of other parts of the world at that time. And yet, there were also moments when desperation led them to try things that make us shudder now, like pressing heated iron to a wound to stop the bleeding or drinking strange brews meant to drive away sickness. And then there were the bone surgeries. Imagine lying on a wooden table, held down by two strong men, while another person takes a sharpened tool and begins scraping at your skull. This wasn't punishment. It was a procedure called trepanation, believed to release pressure or cure madness. Astonishingly, some people survived, and their skulls healed over, suggesting that not all Viking medical practices were as hopeless as they sound. But what happened in those long, dimly lit rooms was always a gamble. Life and death sat so close together that the outcome was never certain. The truth is, Viking medicine was not all brutality. There was care, and there was knowledge passed down through generations, remembered in poems and sagas, and sometimes even carved into wooden sticks. Healers knew which plants could dull pain, which could ease childbirth, which could slow bleeding. They studied the bodies of animals they hunted, learning the way muscles and bones fit together, and used that understanding to treat human injuries. But the line between healer and warrior was thin, and the same hand that sewed up a wound might also wield a sword the next day. In those days, being alive meant living close to danger, and knowing that if harm came to you, the ones who tried to save you would not be gentle. Yet, there was a strange kind of trust in that rough care. You knew they would do whatever it took, whether that meant slicing open your skin to remove an arrowhead or holding you down while they stitched you with thick thread meant for sails. They could not promise survival. No one could, but they could promise to try. Tonight, as the wind shifts and the fire burns low, you can almost hear it. The muffled groan of someone being treated, the soft chant of a healer calling on ancient powers, the metallic clink of tools being set down on a table. Outside, the sea keeps moving, the night keeps growing colder, and the longhouse stays lit with the dim orange glow of the hearth. Somewhere in that glow, a man's life hangs in the balance. The healer leans over him, her hands steady, her face unreadable. She takes a breath and begins the work. And just as the sound of the first cut pierces the silence, we will stop here, because what happens next is not yet certain. Whether he survives or becomes another name in the quiet songs of the dead is a story for another night. The longhouse feels even smaller now. The air is thick with the mingled smells of smoke, sweat, and boiled herbs clinging to the rough wooden walls. Shadows flicker across the beams above as the firelight shifts, and every crack in the timber seems to creak in response to the night outside. The healer kneels beside the wounded man, her knees pressing into the packed earth floor. She is not old, but her eyes carry the kind of weight that comes from having seen too many lives slip away. She works quickly, not because she doesn't care, but because speed is his best chance. She pulls from her pouch a small, curved blade, its edge darkened from repeated heating in the fire. With her other hand, she takes a cloth soaked in warm ale and presses it to the wound. He flinches violently, a deep groan escaping through clenched teeth. The two men holding him down shift their grip, murmuring in low voices to keep him calm. Outside, the sound of boots crunching on frost comes closer. Another warrior enters, his arm bound in strips of linen darkened with blood. He does not speak. He only nods to the healer before settling near the fire, waiting his turn. His injury is not as urgent, but it will need tending before the night is done. That's how it always is after a raid. One after another, they come in, each carrying a fresh reminder that victory in battle never comes without a cost. The healer slices away the cloth around the spear wound. Blood wells up again, thick and dark. She tilts her head, listening to the change in the man's breathing, and makes a decision. She'll have to probe deeper. In a world without metal tweezers or precision instruments, this means using her fingers. She dips her hands into a basin of steaming water mixed with crushed juniper, one of the few plants believed to cleanse and protect against unseen sickness, then slides them into the wound. The man lets out a raw cry, his back arching against the hands that hold him. The sound echoes off the rafters and lingers in the air. Pain is not avoided here, it is endured. There are no opiates, no ether to send him into a dreamless haze. Only the sharp edge of reality and the strength of will to face it. In the corner, an old woman watches silently. Her hair is silver, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes sharp despite her years. She was once the healer herself, before her joints grew too stiff and her hands too slow. Now she passes on her knowledge in quiet moments, teaching the younger woman which herbs to pick in summer, which bones can be set and which cannot, which wounds can be closed and which should be left open to drain. In this moment, she says nothing, but her gaze follows every movement. The healer's fingers find what she is searching for, the jagged point of a spearhead, lodged deep. She works it loose, twisting slightly, then draws it out into the firelight. It is slick with blood, the metal dented and stained from battle. Without hesitation, she drops it into a small wooden bowl and reaches for a strip of linen. The bleeding is heavier now, but that is expected. She presses the cloth hard against the wound, counting the man's breaths until they slow again. From her pouch, she pulls a small leather bag filled with crushed yarrow leaves. These she packs into the wound. Yarrow is believed to stop bleeding and keep rot from setting in. Whether by truth or superstition, The Vikings trusted it, and for some, it worked. The sharp, earthy scent fills the air as she works. She reaches for her needle next. It is long and slightly bent, the kind used for stitching sails, threaded with fine gut string. The men holding the patient brace themselves. The healer leans in close, murmuring something under her breath. It is not a prayer exactly, but a promise to the gods, to the man before her, and perhaps to herself. She pushes the needle through the torn flesh. The first stitch draws a hiss from him, the second a muffled growl, the third a grunt that turns into a cough. Each pull of the thread draws the skin closer, sealing the damage as best she can. When she ties the last knot, she sits back, her face damp with sweat though the air is cold. The wound is not pretty, but it is closed. Now comes the waiting. She pours more ale over the stitches, letting it run down into the cracks, then binds the wound with clean linen. If the spirits are kind, if the herbs do their work, and if his body is strong enough, he will live. If not, she does not let herself think that far ahead. The old woman rises, moving closer. She rests a hand lightly on the healer's shoulder. "Good work," she says in a voice that is almost a whisper. Then, looking at the wounded man, she adds, "The gods will decide the rest." In the quiet that follows, the other warrior steps forward. His wound is a deep slash along his forearm, clean but gaping. The healer sets to work again, washing, packing, stitching. Her hands move with the same steady rhythm, though her shoulders ache and her eyes burn from the smoke. Somewhere outside, a child cries, and a dog answers with a low bark. Life in the settlement continues as it always does, small moments of normalcy framed by the constant possibility of loss. Everyone knows that one day, they might be the one on the bench, biting leather, hoping the healer's hands will be enough. As the night wears on, the fire burns low. The young man with the spear wound drifts in and out of shallow sleep, his face pale, his breathing slow but even. The healer checks the bandage one last time, her fingers pressing gently against the linen to feel for fresh bleeding. She finds none. For now, that is enough. Yet outside, beyond the safety of the firelight, another sound rises. A horn in the distance, faint but unmistakable. The warriors in the room freeze for a moment, listening. The healer's eyes flick toward the door. She knows that sound. It means more coming. And with them, more wounds, more pain, and more chances for the thin line between life and death to be tested again. And somewhere deep inside, she wonders, will her hands still be steady when the next patient is carried in? The horn sounds again, closer this time, cutting through the low murmur of voices in the longhouse. It is not a call of celebration. It is the sharp, urgent note used to signal trouble. The healer's hands pause in mid-motion as she finishes tying the last knot on the warrior's forearm. For breath, the fire seems to crackle louder, as if it too is listening. One of the older men in the room, his beard thick and streaked with gray, sets down his drinking horn and rises slowly. "They're coming back from the fjord," he says, voice low. Something happened. His eyes move to the door, but he doesn't leave yet. He knows that when the warriors come in, the healer will need him, not to fight, but to hold down the wounded, to lift bodies from the cold ground to the warm benches. The healer doesn't ask questions. She quickly rinses her hands in the basin, watching the water cloud with blood and herbs. The old woman moves to stoke the fire, throwing on a fresh piece of driftwood that hisses and spits as it catches. The longhouse fills with the smell of damp smoke. Then the door opens and the cold night air sweeps in, along with the sound of heavy boots and strained breathing. Two men stumble inside, half carrying, half dragging a third between them. His head hangs forward, hair plastered to his face with blood. His tunic is torn wide across the chest, and the skin beneath is slick with something dark that glistens in the firelight. They lay him on the bench without ceremony. The healer is already moving, cutting away the fabric with her small blade. The wound beneath is deep, a wide gash across the ribs, the edges ragged. She can see bone through the torn muscle. It's the kind of injury that can drain a man's strength in minutes if nothing is done. "Hold him," she orders, and the men obey without hesitation. The wounded man stirs weakly, his breath coming in short, shallow bursts. His skin is cold, his lips pale. This is bad. She knows it. She reaches for her pouch, fingers closing around the same yarrow leaves she used before. But this time she hesitates. The wound is too wide. Packing it with herbs will not be enough to stop the bleeding. She needs something stronger, something she learned from the old woman in the quiet months of winter. From a wooden shelf near the fire, she takes a small clay pot sealed with wax. Inside is a dark paste made from crushed plantain leaves, honey, and ash. It is thick, sticky, and bitter-smelling. Honey, she has been told, can keep rot away. The ash comes from burnt birch, ground fine, meant to seal and dry the wound. Whether it is the god's gift or simple craft, she has seen it work. She presses the mixture directly into the gash, her fingers sure despite the heat of fresh blood. The man jerks once, teeth clenched so hard his jaw trembles. She says nothing, only keeps working, spreading the paste into every torn space. When it is done, she takes her largest needle and begins to close the wound. Each stitch pulls skin and muscle together, her hands moving with precision born from repetition. She knows the thread is coarse and will leave scars, but scars are a small price compared to death. Outside, voices rise and fall in the dark. More men returning, more news of whatever happened to the fjord. But inside, the world has shrunk to the small space between the healer and her patient. Her breath comes in quiet, steady pulls. The fire pops. The needle moves. The old woman stands nearby, watching. "You must hurry," she murmurs, almost to herself. His spirit is halfway to the other side. The healer doesn't answer. She knots the last stitch, then takes a strip of linen soaked in the herb brew and binds the man's chest tightly. She feels for his pulse, faint but present, and lets out a slow breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. The two warriors who brought him and looked down at the still figure. "He fell from the boat," one says finally. "The water was black with blood before we could pull him out. Save the telling for later," the old woman says sharply. "Go help the others. There will be more." And there are. Before the healer can wash her hands, another figure stumbles through the doorway. This one is clutching his leg, the fabric around it soaked through. Behind him comes a young boy, too young for battle, barely in his teens, supporting the man's weight with all the strength he can muster. His face is pale, eyes wide at the sight of so much blood. The healer moves quickly, guiding the man to a bench. The wound is from a blade, cleaner than the last, but deep. She works without speaking, cleaning it with warm ale, then pressing a pad of moss against it. Not just any moss. She uses sphagnum moss, gathered from the wet edges of the marsh. She knows it draws out moisture and helps keep wounds from festering. She binds it tight with linen, leaving the man able to stand with help. The boy watches every move, his eyes following the needle, the hands, the knotting of the bandage. "Will he live?" he asks finally, his voice small. The healer glances at the man, then at the boy. "If the gods are kind," she says. It is not a promise, but it is all she can give. As the hours pass, the benches fill. The longhouse is crowded with the wounded, some groaning softly, some lying silent, their faces turned toward the fire. The air is warm now, too warm, heavy with the smells of herbs, smoke, and blood. Outside, the horn sounds no more, but the distant shouts of men and the splash of oars in the water tell her the night's work is far from over. Between patients, the healer stops for a moment, leaning against the wall. Her hands ache, her shoulders burn, and her eyes feel dry as ash. She takes a sip of water, swishes it around her mouth to wash away the taste of blood and smoke, then swallows. The old woman appears beside her, pressing a strip of dried meat into her hand. "Eat," she says. "You'll need your strength." She chews slowly, her mind already moving to what might come next. She knows that some of the men she has treated tonight will not see the sunrise. No matter how many wounds she closes, how many herbs she uses, or how steady her hands, death walks too closely in this place. Still, she will try. She always tries. The door opens again, and this time, the air that sweeps in is colder, sharper. The man who enters is not wounded himself, but his face is grim. "There's one more," he says, his voice tight. "But he's different." The healer straightens. "Bring him." The man hesitates. "You should come outside." Something in his tone makes the old woman frown. The healer wipes her hands on her apron and follows him into the night. The sky is heavy with clouds, the moon just a pale blur behind them. The wind from the fjord carries the tang of salt and something else, something metallic. At the edge of the dock, two men are kneeling beside a still figure. Even from a distance, she can see the unnatural way his body lies, as though he were twisted mid-step and then frozen. His skin is pale, almost gray, and there is no blood she can see. She takes a step closer, and her stomach tightens. Whatever has happened here is not like the others. This is no simple wound, no cut or break she can stitch or bind. The old woman's words come back to her. His spirit is halfway to the other side. Only this man, his spirit might already be gone. And yet, his eyes are open. The wind off the fjord cuts through her cloak, carrying the smell of the sea and the faint tang of fish from the boats moored nearby. The healer kneels beside the man, her knees pressing into the damp wood of the dock. His eyes stare upward, fixed on the clouds, but there is no flicker of recognition when she leans over him. They are wide, glassy, and disturbingly still. She places her fingers at his neck, searching for the steady rhythm of a pulse. For a moment, she feels nothing but the chill of his skin. Then, faintly, she finds it, slow, uneven, like a drumbeat fading into silence. He is not yet gone, but he is far from the living warmth of the others she has treated tonight. "What happened?" she asks, glancing at the men who brought him. One of them shakes his head. "We found him on the shore. No wounds, no blood. Just lying there as you see him now, breathing barely." The healer studies the man's chest. His breaths are shallow and irregular, each one seeming to cost him effort. She pulls aside his tunic, looking for bruises, swelling, anything that might explain his state. But his skin is smooth, unmarked. No gashes, no breaks. The old woman steps forward, her eyes narrowing. "Sometimes the sea takes more than it gives back," she says in a tone that is neither explanation nor comfort. "Bring him inside. The night air will finish what the water started." The men lift him carefully, though his body feels strangely limp, as though he weighs less than he should. They carry him into the longhouse, laying him on a bench near the fire. The healer notices how the warmth does not seem to touch him. His skin remains cool, his lips pale. She begins with the simplest things, removing his damp clothes, wrapping him in dry wool, rubbing his arms and chest to bring back warmth. She pours a little warmed mead to his lips, but it dribbles out, and his throat makes no effort to swallow. Something about him unsettles her. Every patient she has ever treated has shown signs of life in their pain. Groans, flinches, resistance. But this man is utterly still, as though whatever part of him feels pain is already gone. She decides to check his head. Running her fingers along his scalp, she finds a swelling just above his temple, hidden beneath his hair. The skin there is warm, tender. She presses lightly, and the faintest sound escapes his lips, a breath, or maybe a sigh. "A blow to the head," she says quietly. "Not enough to break the skull, but enough to put him here." The old woman nods slowly. "He walks between worlds now. You may bring him back, or not at all." The healer fetches a cloth soaked in warm water and lays it over the swelling. She has no herbs to heal the damage beneath the bone, no way to mend what the eye cannot see. But she can keep him warm, keep his breathing steady, and hope the rest will follow. As she works, the longhouse around her hums with low voices. The other wounded shift in their sleep, the fire crackles, and outside, the wind picks up again. The smell of the fjord drifts in through the cracks in the wall, mingling with the sharp scent of herbs. Hours pass. She checks his pulse again, still faint but there. From time to time, his eyelids twitch, but he does not wake. She wipes his face with warm water, speaking softly as she works. Not because she thinks he can hear, but because it feels wrong to be silent with someone hovering so close to death. In the corner, the boy who came in earlier with the injured man sits watching her. His eyes are wide, reflecting the firelight. He doesn't look hurt, he says quietly. He is hurt, she replies, just not where you can see it. The boy nods, though he does not seem to fully understand. His gaze lingers on the still figure before drifting to the healer's hands. Will you fix him like you fixed the others? She hesitates. I will try. As the night deepens, the long house grows quieter. Some of the wounded sleep. Others murmur in half-dreams. The healer keeps her place beside the strange man, occasionally feeling his pulse, adjusting his blankets, and changing the cloth on his head. Then, without warning, his hand twitches. Not a random spasm, but a sudden, purposeful movement, as though reaching for something. She leans closer, watching his face. His lips part slightly, and a faint whisper escapes, too soft for her to catch. She bends lower. What is it? What do you see? His eyes shift, not fully focusing, but turning toward her. The whisper comes again, clearer this time, a single word spoken with effort. It is not one she recognizes immediately. It sounds old, older even in the tongue they speak in the longhouse. The old woman, sitting nearby, looks up sharply when she hears it. What did he say? The healer asks. The old woman's gaze lingers on the man's face for a long moment before she answers. A name, she says quietly, one that should not be spoken here. Before the healer can ask more, the man's body goes still again. His breathing evens out, but his hand falls limp at his side. The old woman rises, walking to the far end of the longhouse to tend the fire. The healer feels a weight in her chest, part fear, part curiosity. She wants to ask the name, to know why the old woman reacted as she did. But the silence in the longhouse seems too thick now, as though speaking it aloud would carry it farther than the walls. Instead, she focuses on her patient, adjusting his blankets one more time. She tells herself she will wait until morning, when the light makes shadows less heavy, to ask. But in the back of her mind, she knows that whatever that man whispered, it was not meant for her alone. And outside, beyond the firelight, the wind carries something faint, almost like the echo of that same word, out over the dark water. The longhouse had grown quieter, but the healer could not rest. Every few moments, her eyes returned to the man with the pale skin and the half-breathing chest. She told herself she was only checking his pulse, his warmth, the steady rise and fall of his ribs. But there was something more. Something about the way he lay there, too still, too silent, made her feel as though he was not simply wounded, but caught in a place no one else in the room could reach. She sat back on the bench, the low light from the hearth casting shadows across her hands. Her fingers still smelled faintly of yarrow and honey, the scents clinging even after she had rinsed them. She had treated men with head wounds before. Some had woken in days, others never at all. But she could not recall one whose first words, whispered from the edge of consciousness, had been a name that made the old woman's eyes turn sharp. The old woman herself was seated at the far end of the fire, pulling apart dried herbs and laying them in neat bundles. She had said nothing more about the word, and that silence hung heavy between them. It was not the kind of silence that comes from forgetting. It was the kind that comes from choosing not to speak. Outside, the wind rattled the wooden walls, and the distant call of the sea birds drifted in. The healer closed her eyes for a moment, letting the sounds settle in her mind. It was strange to think that only hours ago, the settlement had been alive with the noise of returning boats, the clash of weapons, and the rush to bring the injured inside. Now, those sounds had faded, replaced by the low breathing of men sleeping off pain and exhaustion. The boy who had come in earlier was still awake, sitting near the wounded man as though guarding him. His small hands were clasped in his lap, and his eyes kept flicking toward the stranger's face. He looked tired, but there was a stubbornness to his posture, as if leaving his place would somehow let danger slip in. The healer leaned toward him. "You should sleep," she said gently. "I'm not tired," he whispered back, though his voice betrayed the lie. "You've been sitting here a long time. I want to hear if he says something again." The healer studied him for a moment. "Do you know him?" The boy hesitated then shook his head. No, but I saw him before. At the shore. Days ago, before the raid. He was just standing there, staring at the water. This caught her attention. Was he with anyone? No, the boy said. He didn't talk to anyone. I thought maybe he was waiting for a boat, but none came. The healer felt a small shiver along her spine. She wanted to ask more, but the boy's eyelids were drooping now, and his chin dipped forward. She let him be. Children noticed things adults did not, but they also dreamed strange dreams, and she could not tell yet which this was. She returned to the man. His breathing was no better, but no worse. She laid her hand against his chest and felt the faint thump of his heart beneath her palm. The swelling on his temple had not grown, but it had not gone down either. She replaced the warm cloth and smoothed the damp hair from his forehead. As she worked, her mind turned over the possibilities. A blow to the head could steal memory, speech, movement, but it could not explain the coldness of his skin, the strange way he seemed apart from the room, even in the midst of its warmth. Nor could it explain why the old woman had called his whispered word a name that should not be spoken here. When she glanced toward the fire again, she found the old woman watching her. Their eyes met, and for a moment, neither spoke. Then the old woman said, "You should not linger so close to him." The healer frowned. "Why?" "Some injuries are of the body," the old woman said, her voice low. "Others are of the spirit, and the spirit can take what it touches." The healer almost laughed, but there was no humor in the old woman's face. "You think he is cursed?" she asked quietly. "I think," the old woman replied, "that he is not entirely here." The word stayed with her long after the old woman turned back to her herbs. She had seen many strange things. Men waking from fever with voices they had never spoken before, women healed of wounds only to sicken days later without cause. But she had never considered that a man might come back from the shore carrying something unseen. By the time the first pale light of dawn slipped into the longhouse, her eyes were heavy. The wounded stirred one by one, wincing as the cold morning air crept in. She moved among them, checking bandages, replacing dressings, offering sips of water. When she returned to the stranger's bench, the boy was gone, finally given over to sleep. The man's eyes were closed now, but his face looked different in the early light. Not peaceful, not pained, but as though he were listening to something far away. She leaned close, wondering if he would speak again, if he would give her the answer to the questions circling in her mind. But his lips stayed still. Outside, the settlement was waking. She could hear the splash of oars, the voices of women calling to each other as they began the day's work. Somewhere a dog barked. Life went on, even as this man hovered between here and whatever lay beyond. She touched his wrist, feeling for his pulse. Still there, still faint, still refusing to tell her which way he would turn. And somewhere in that quiet moment, she realized that the mystery was not just in who he was, but in what had happened before the men brought him to her bench. The boy had seen him days ago, alone at the shore. Now he was here, almost gone, speaking a name that carried weight enough to make the old woman's voice drop. Whatever story lay between those two moments was still out there, somewhere between the sea and the settlement, waiting for someone to follow it. And though she did not yet know it, that someone was going to be her. By the time the fire in the hall had burned down to glowing embers, Leaf had already decided he wouldn't sleep that night. The air smelled of smoke, pine resin, and something sharper, fresh pine tar boiling in the iron cauldron near the healer's bench. It was a smell he had known since childhood, yet tonight it made his stomach tighten. The healer, a wiry old woman named Astrid, was crouched on a low stool, stirring the tar slowly. Her hands moved with the ease of decades of habit, but her eyes darted to the doorway now and then, as if she were expecting trouble. Leaf sat across from her, polishing his father's old knife, its bone handle worn smooth by years of use. The blade wasn't for fighting tonight. It was for cutting strips of cloth. Astrid had told him they would need plenty before morning came. Somewhere beyond the walls, a man lay in the snow, shivering and bleeding after a raid gone wrong. The others would bring him here when the moon rose higher, and Astrid would try to save him. The room was dim except for the fire's flicker, which caught on the rows of tools hanging from the wall. Iron tongs, bone needles, sharp knives, and a small bronze bowl polished bright from use. Some were everyday items, the sort of fisherman or farmer might own. Others were stranger, shaped for purposes Leaf didn't want to think about yet. Astrid's shadow loomed over them as she moved, and for a moment, it seemed like the tools themselves were leaning closer, waiting. She finally spoke without looking at him. "You've seen wounds before, but tonight you'll see what happens when the wound isn't the worst of it." Her voice was low, almost lost under the crackle of the coals. "Sometimes what hides inside is far more dangerous." Leaf frowned. "You mean fever?" Astrid gave a small nod. "A sickness that crawls under the skin. You can't always see it, but you can smell it. You can feel it in the heat of the flesh." She lifted the tar-coated stick from the cauldron and set it aside to cool. "We have our ways to fight it. They're not always gentle." Outside, the wind pressed against the walls with a hollow sound, and Leaf's thoughts drifted to the kind of stories elders told during long winter nights. Tales of healers who cut into swollen flesh to drain the poison, of men who survived arrow wounds only to be lost to fever days later, and of strange cures, steam baths so hot they nearly burned the skin, bitter herbs that made a man retch, and the sharp sting of fermented mead poured straight into an open wound. Astrid kept working, gathering bundles of dried herbs from the rafters. Their scents mixed in the air, sage, yarrow, and something sharp and bitter he couldn't name. She crushed them in a stone bowl, the rhythmic grinding filling the silence. Each sound seemed louder in the quiet, as if the room itself were listening. "You still have doubts?" she said suddenly. Leaf hesitated. "I've seen strong men die after a healer's work. I've also seen them live. I can't tell which is luck and which is skill." She gave a small smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. "That's because it's both. The gods give us strength, but they also give us the will to act. Sometimes the difference between life and death is just not hesitating." Her words stayed with him as the door burst open a short while later, letting in a gust of icy air and two figures struggling under a heavy weight. The injured man was slumped between them, his head hanging forward, his breath ragged and uneven. Even in the firelight, Leaf could see the dark stains spreading across his tunic. They laid him on the low bench, and Astrid was beside him in an instant. She worked quickly, cutting away the blood-soaked fabric with a small, curved knife. The smell hit Leaf before he could prepare for it, a metallic tang of blood mixed with something heavier, almost sweet. Astrid muttered instructions, and Leaf obeyed without thinking, handing her strips of cloth, a pot of hot water, the bronze bowl. His hands were steady, but inside his chest felt tight. The wound was deep, a long slash across the man's ribs, and the edges of the flesh were already swollen. "Too much swelling," Astrid murmured. "We have to open it wider, or it will close on itself and trap the sickness inside." Leaf froze. The idea of making the wound bigger when the man was already so pale seemed almost cruel. But Astrid's tone left no room for doubt. She reached for one of the narrow knives, its blade gleaming in the firelight, and glanced at Leaf. "Hold him," she said simply. He stepped forward, placing his hands on the man's shoulders. The muscles beneath his palms twitched, then tensed. The man's breathing quickened. Astrid's hand moved in a quick, practiced motion, and the air in the room seemed to tighten with it. Leaf tried not to look, but the sound, that wet, careful slice, stayed in his ears. The man groaned, low and deep, his breath catching. Astrid worked with the same calm she had stirring the tar, her fingers sure and quick. Steam rose from the hot cloth she pressed against the wound, and she leaned close, inspecting her work as if she were carving wood or shaping a piece of iron. But this was no craft that could be undone. Once cut, the body could not be made exactly as it was before. And Leaf wondered, not for the first time, how many lives were saved by these methods, and how many were lost because there had simply been no other choice. Outside, the wind howled again, and the shutters rattled. Inside, Astrid set down the knife and reached for the tar. She dipped a clean stick into the thick, dark liquid and let it drip slowly into the wound. The smell was strong and sharp, and the injured man's body jolted as if the heat had burned deep. Leif glanced at Astrid, but she didn't look up. Her eyes stayed on the work, her jaw tight. She didn't speak again, but Leif thought he could read something in her expression, a knowledge of how close the edge between life and death truly was. The man's breathing slowed, though whether from exhaustion or relief, Leif couldn't tell. Astrid sat back at last, wiping her hands on a cloth. The firelight painted deep lines across her face, and for a moment, she seemed older than the mountains themselves. "Now," she said quietly, "we wait. The wound is not our only enemy." Leif didn't ask what she meant. He already knew. The real test would come in the days ahead, when fever might creep in like a thief in the night. And if it did, Astrid would have to fight it with every tool and every strange method passed down through generations. Methods as feared as they were respected. The bench creaked as Leif shifted, glancing at the man's pale face. Somewhere deep inside, he felt the weight of a question he wasn't ready to speak aloud. How far would they go to save a life? And at what cost? The snow outside continued to fall, muffling the world in silence. Inside the hall, the fire crackled softly, and the shadow of Astrid's tools stretched long against the wall. Somewhere in that silence, between the steady drip of melted snow from the roof and the slow, shallow breaths of the man on the bench, an unspoken truth hung heavy. Whatever happened next would not be gentle. The old healer's hut smelled of damp moss and faint smoke, a mix of herbs and ash that clung to the air like a second skin. Inside, the dim light from a small oil lamp cast long, trembling shadows on the walls, making the place feel alive with movement. Ingrid sat on a rough bench near the fire, her eyes fixed on a clay pot in which some bitter-smelling liquid simmered. She had been told it was for pain, though she knew well enough from the way the warriors returned from battle that Viking pain relief was more a prayer than a promise. Eric was lying on a fur-covered table at the center of the hut, his left leg bound tightly with strips of wool. Blood had long since soaked through, leaving dark stains that seemed to swallow the firelight. His breathing came in uneven bursts. Every so often, a low groan escaped him despite his effort to stay silent. Viking warriors prided themselves on enduring agony without complaint, but pain was a force even the bravest could not always master. Across from him, the healer, an older man named Stig, moved slowly, like someone who had done this too many times and knew exactly how much could go wrong. His beard was streaked with gray, his fingers rough from years of grinding herbs and stitching wounds. He had been on countless raids as the crew's unofficial leech, tending to arrow wounds, crushed bones, and the deep gashes from enemy axes. The fire hissed as Stig dropped a handful of dried willow bark into the pot. The bitter scent deepened. "This will dull the mind," he muttered, though not to anyone in particular. His voice was low and even, but Ingrid noticed the smallest tremor in his hands. It was not fear, exactly. It was the quiet knowledge that what he was about to do could either save Eric's leg or take it entirely. Outside, the wind carried the faint sound of waves hitting the shore, but it was muffled here, buried under the hush of anticipation. Another warrior, Harold, leaned against the wall near the entrance. His arms were crossed, his face unreadable, but his eyes flicked constantly toward Eric. They had fought side by side since boyhood, and Harold knew what losing a leg would mean for his friend. A warrior who could not stand was no warrior at all in their world. Stig finally approached the table, holding a long, thin piece of iron that had been resting in the fire. Its tip glowed orange-red. Ingrid's breath caught. She had seen the tool before, used for cauterizing wounds when stitching would not stop the bleeding. She also knew it was the last resort. Eric's gaze shifted to her, just for a moment, and in that look she saw the same thing she had seen when her father went to fight his last battle, a silent acceptance that the gods would decide the outcome. The healer set the hot iron aside for the moment and began carefully unwinding the wool from around the leg. The wound was ugly, a deep slice just above the knee, the flesh swollen and angry-looking. "This came from an axe," Stig said quietly, inspecting the damage. "A heavy one. It cut deep and brought dirt into the wound. He didn't have to say more. Dirt meant infection, and infection meant death unless it could be cut away. Ingrid reached for Eric's hand and felt his grip tighten. He didn't ask what would happen next. Perhaps he didn't want to hear it. Harold shifted uncomfortably, his boots scraping the floor. Stig poured some of the willow bark brew into a horn cup and held it to Eric's lips. "Drink." Eric drank, though the bitterness twisted his face. It would make him dizzy, maybe dull the edges of the pain, but it was no magic potion. Once the cup was empty, Stig reached for a sharp knife. He didn't bother to hide it. There was no point. Ingrid could feel the tension in the air grow heavier. The healer's face was calm, but his eyes were fixed, calculating. Every cut had to be precise. Every hesitation could cost too much blood. He began by cleaning the wound with cold water, his fingers moving quickly, pressing into the swollen flesh to force out dirt and fragments of cloth. Eric's breathing grew faster, his knuckles white against the fur beneath him. Ingrid kept her hand on his, whispering words she wasn't sure he could hear. The moment stretched. The sound of the knife against flesh was soft but sharp enough to make Harold glance away. The smell of iron and blood mingled with the smoke from the fire, filling the small hut. Stig paused, his brow furrowing. He reached for a different tool, a curved bone scraper, one Ingrid had seen only a few times. It was used to clean deeper wounds, to scrape away what could not be cut. Eric tensed as the tool touched him, but he made no sound. His eyes stared upward at the roof beams, fixed on nothing. When Stig finally pulled back, the wound looked cleaner, but the bleeding had not stopped. Ingrid could see the healer's mind working, measuring the chances. The glowing iron still waited in the firelight. "Hold him," Stig said. Harold moved forward without hesitation, pressing his weight down on Eric's shoulders. Ingrid's stomach nodded. She knew what was about to happen. The healer lifted the iron from the coals, the heat radiating from it even where she sat. He pressed it firmly against the wound. The sound was a harsh hiss, the smell rising like burnt leather. Eric's body jerked violently, but Harold kept him pinned. The moment seemed to stretch into forever before Stig finally pulled the iron away. Eric's face was pale, his breath shallow, but the bleeding had slowed. Stig set the iron down, his hand steady now. "It may be enough," he murmured, though there was no certainty in his voice. Ingrid looked at him, searching for something more, a promise, a reassurance, but there was none. In a Viking world, promises meant little when the body was at war with itself. Outside, the wind rattled the wooden walls, and for a moment, it sounded like distant drums. Stig wrapped the leg in clean linen, binding it tightly. He worked in silence, as though speaking might disturb whatever fragile balance had been reached. Harold stepped back, his arms loosening, but his eyes never left Eric's face. When it was done, Stig leaned back and finally exhaled a long, slow breath. "We wait," he said simply. Ingrid nodded, though waiting felt like the hardest task of all. The fire crackled, the shadows moved, and in that cramped hut, they all understood that the next hours would decide everything. But far away, beyond the reach of their little world, a ship was coming into the fjord, its crew carrying not just goods and weapons, but stories of a new sickness spreading across distant shores. A sickness that no iron, no herb, and no healer's skill could touch. And though they did not yet know it, the horrors of Viking medicine were about to face a far greater test than any battle wound. The more I listened to Eric and the others talk, the more I began to notice how much of Viking medicine was not just about the body, but about belief. The healers didn't separate the mind, the spirit, and the flesh. They treated them as one. If a man came in with a festering wound, they would treat the infection, but they would also ask about his dreams, his recent quarrels, and whether he had offended any of the gods. Illness, to them, was often a sign of something out of balance, not just in the body, but in life itself. Old Sigrid, a woman whose hair was the color of snow and whose eyes looked like they had seen more winters than anyone could count, was especially known for this approach. She carried with her a small pouch of runes carved from animal bone, each marked with symbols that she said were older than the sagas. She would scatter them across a piece of deerskin and read their meaning before deciding on a treatment. Sometimes it meant brewing herbs into a tea. Other times it meant instructing the patient to make an offering at the shrine down by the shore. There are even times she would tell them to leave the village for a few days, to sleep under the stars until their spirit felt light again. The men respected her, though some grumbled that she relied too much on the old ways instead of using the iron tools like the younger healers. But Eric told me quietly that more often than not, her patients recovered. She understands the sickness behind the sickness, he said one night as we sat near the fire. That's something even the best knife can't cut out. In the long winter months, when the snow piled high against the longhouses and the sea was frozen at the edges, sickness was a constant fear. The cold made wounds slow to heal. Coughs lingered. Food was harder to keep fresh. When the daylight hours were few, people huddled inside and breathed the same air for days, perfect for illness to spread. The healers had remedies for these ailments too. They burned pine needles to cleanse the air, hung bunches of juniper and thyme in the rafters, and mixed honey with herbs to soothe sore throats. Honey, they said, was a gift from the gods, sweet, golden, and almost magical in its ability to keep things from rotting. But as I watched them work, I began to notice something else. Not all their cures were so gentle. There were times when the healer's hand had to be as steady and fearless as that of a warrior. I once saw Eric tend to a fisherman who had slipped on the icy dock and driven a jagged piece of wood deep into his palm. The wound was angry and swollen, and the fisherman's face was pale with pain. Eric didn't hesitate. He heated his knife in the fire until it glowed faintly, then cut away the splinter, ignoring the man's muffled groans. He packed the wound with moss soaked in a pungent liquid and bound it tight with strips of linen. The fisherman would have no use of his hand for weeks, but Eric said it was better than losing it entirely. Some nights, when the wind howled and the torches flickered in the draft, I heard stories about Viking surgery that made my skin crawl. They spoke of trepanation, the practice of cutting a hole into the skull to relieve pressure or treat head injuries. It sounded unthinkable, yet there were old warriors in the village who bore the faint, round scars to prove they had survived it. The healers claimed that some people woke from the procedure with sharper minds, clearer thoughts, and fewer headaches. Of course, others didn't wake at all. I began to realize that in this world, medicine was never just about healing. It was about survival, even if that meant taking risks that could go either way. The healers had no luxury of waiting for the perfect treatment. They used what they had, when they had it, and they accepted that the gods would decide the rest. Still, there were times when I wondered if all their practices were truly guided by wisdom, or if some were simply traditions carried forward, because no one dared to question them. One evening, as the village gathered for a feast, I noticed a young boy with a deep cut on his leg. Instead of cleaning it with herbs, the healer pressed the edge of a heated iron coin against the wound. The boy bit down on a piece of wood, his eyes watering as the smell of scorched flesh filled the air. Eric told me this was to seal the wound against evil. Perhaps it worked, but I couldn't help thinking of the infection that might still grow beneath the burn. There were whispers, too, the kind that people only spoke in the shadows. Some said there were healers who could curse as well as cure, that with the same herbs that mended bones, they could brew poisons that killed slowly, making a rival waste away without a single blade being drawn. I never saw proof of this, but the way some villagers avoided certain healers told me they believed it enough to be cautious. One day, a storm rolled in from the sea, dark clouds swallowing the horizon. The wind rattled the doors, and the air tasted of salt and rain. A group of men carried in a stranger they had found washed ashore. His clothes were torn, his face bruised, and his arm hung at an odd angle. Sigurd took one look at him and ordered the others to clear space by the fire. I watched as she set his arm with a swift, almost brutal motion, the crack of bone making everyone wince. Then she began to hum, a low, steady sound that seemed to fill the room. She sprinkled herbs over the fire, sending up a sharp, sweet smoke. The man's eyes fluttered open for a moment, but instead of gratitude, there was fear in them. His gaze darted from Sigrid to the runes on the wall, then to the iron tools laid out beside her. His lips moved, but the words were in a tongue I didn't recognize. I could see Eric tense. Later, he told me that the man had spoken of blood payment and shadows on the shore. But before I could ask what that meant, the storm outside rose to a deafening roar, and the firelight flickered wildly. The next morning, the stranger was gone. No one could tell me where he had gone, or perhaps no one wanted to. Sigrid only said, "The sea takes back what it wants," and returned to tending her herbs. Yet I noticed that from that day on, she began wearing a small pouch of dried flowers around her neck, and the other healers followed suit. Whatever had happened that night, it had unsettled even the most experienced among them. And then came the first whispers of a sickness moving along the coast. A fever that struck fast, leaving the skin pale and the breath short. Villagers began glancing toward the horizon with unease, as if expecting to see it coming over the waves. The healers prepared their herbs, their knives, and their charms, but I could sense it. Whatever this was, it would test their skills in ways they hadn't faced in years. And deep down, I wasn't sure they were ready. The days in the village seemed to move slowly, yet there was always an undercurrent of unease. Eric, the old healer, had grown quieter over the past week, speaking less during his visits to the market and spending more time alone in his small hut near the edge of the forest. Some said he was simply growing old. Others whispered that he was preparing for something the villagers would not understand. His apprentice, a young woman named Solveig, had noticed it too. She saw how his hands lingered over his worn leather satchel, fingers tracing the outlines of the strange tools inside, as if weighing a decision he had not yet made. The main trouble was the sickness spreading through the settlement. It began with just a few coughing in the night, but soon more and more were staying home instead of working in the fields or fishing. People came to Eric's hut at all hours, desperate for his remedies. Herbs steeped in boiling water, paste made from crushed roots, charms strung together with bits of animal bone. Some improved, but others didn't. And when they didn't, the fear grew sharper. The Vikings were fierce warriors, but sickness was a battle they could not meet with sword and shield. One afternoon, a family brought in a boy who could barely open his eyes. His breathing rattled like a loose board in the wind. Eric examined him under the dim light of the hut, his brow furrowed. He prepared a mixture of willow bark and honey, forcing small spoonfuls between the boy's lips, but Solveig noticed how Eric's shoulders tensed. He had seen this before. She wanted to ask him, but the look in his eyes kept her silent. The sickness wasn't the only trouble. Injuries from raids and training piled up alongside the illness. Warriors with deep cuts, broken bones, and burns sought Eric's help. In those moments, Solveig saw the other side of Viking medicine, the kind that required grit more than gentle care. Bones were pulled into place with rough hands, wounds cleaned with ale that burned as much as the injury itself, stitches done with thread made from animal sinew. It was not delicate work. It was survival. Eric's methods were not without risk. The people trusted him because he had saved many over the years, but they also feared him. His knowledge of herbs and anatomy seemed almost unnatural to some. A few muttered that he spoke with spirits or that he learned his skills from lands far beyond the fjords. It was true that he had traveled. Years ago, as a young man, he had sailed with traders to the east and learned from healers in places most villagers couldn't name. But the details of those journeys were his secret, and even Solveig, after years under his guidance, only knew fragments. One evening, as the sun sank behind the mountains and painted the sea in gold and crimson, Solveig found Eric sitting outside, sharpening one of his surgical knives. The blade gleamed in the dying light. She hesitated, then asked the question that had been pressing on her mind. "This sickness, have you seen it before?" Eric paused, running his thumb along the edge of the knife. "Once," he said, his voice low, "in a port far from here. It took many before it burned itself out." "Then you know how to stop it?" she pressed. He shook his head. "I know how to help some, but not all." His eyes met hers, and she saw the weight of years in them. "And there are things we may need to do that the people will not understand." Before Solveig could ask what he meant, the sound of hurried footsteps came from the path. A young warrior appeared, pale and sweating, one hand pressed against his side. When he pulled it away, his palm was slick with blood. He had been injured while repairing one of the ships, the wooden plank splitting and sending a jagged spike deep into his ribs. Eric moved quickly, guiding the man inside. He and Solveig worked in silence, boiling water, laying out the knives, preparing strips of linen. Solveig tried not to look at the wound too closely, but the smell of iron filled the air. This was Viking medicine at its harshest, and there was no choice but to act. Eric poured ale over the wound, the man biting down on a strip of leather to keep from crying out. The knife worked quickly, cutting away splinters that would lodge deep inside. Solveig's hands trembled as she held the lantern steady. When it was done, the man lay breathing heavily, his skin pale but his pulse still strong. Eric bound the wound tightly and told him to rest. But as the warrior left, Eric didn't relax. Instead, he cleaned his tools with slow, deliberate care. "This will not be the last tonight," he said quietly. Solveig didn't know if he meant more injuries or more sickness. Maybe both. The village was restless now, worried that the sickness was a curse or punishment from the gods. Some spoke of sacrifices. Others looked to Eric for answers he didn't have. And somewhere in the middle of all of it, whispers began to spread about a ship seen on the horizon, carrying strangers. That night, Solveig lay awake on her straw bed, the sound of the sea creeping in through the cracks in the walls. She thought of the sick boy, of the blood on the young warrior's hands, of Eric's warning. And she couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was coming next would test them all in ways they were not ready for. The next morning brought no comfort. The fog rolled in from the water, heavy and cold, shrouding the village in a pale gray. People moved quietly, voices low. The sick were worse. Eric visited each one, checking pulses, touching foreheads, whispering instructions to their families. Solveig followed, carrying the satchel of herbs and salves. At the last house, they found the boy from earlier, his breathing weaker, his skin clammy. Eric looked at Solveig and gave the smallest shake of his head. They stayed with him until the sun dipped low again, but by nightfall, the boy's chest rose no more. The loss hung over the village like a shadow. And yet, that same evening, a loud horn echoed from the shore. The ship that had been only a rumor was now real. It sailed dark against the horizon. Strangers were coming, and no one knew if they carried help or something far worse. As the days passed, Einar began to notice changes in the way people moved through the village. There was a heaviness in their steps, a quiet hesitation that hadn't been there before. It wasn't just the harsh winter air slowing them down. It was something else, something deeper. Whispers had started to drift from house to house about strange dreams that left people waking in a cold sweat. They spoke of shadowy figures standing at the edge of their beds, of voices calling their names in the dead of night. No one could explain it, but many were convinced it had to do with the sick and the way their bodies were being treated. The idea of Viking medicine, once seen as strong and reliable, was starting to carry a darker reputation. Einar's sister, Liv, was one of the first to say it aloud. She told him that she'd heard from a friend that a man's spirit could be trapped if his body wasn't treated properly. She didn't mean disrespect to the healers. No one dared, but she said the old ways were being forgotten. Instead of chanting over wounds or burning herbs to cleanse a sick room, some healers were focusing only on the knife, cutting, scraping, and stitching without calling on the spirits at all. Liv thought that might be the reason so many people had restless dreams. Einar didn't know whether to believe her or not, but he couldn't deny that the air in the village had grown heavier, as though each breath carried a hint of smoke from a fire no one could see. One afternoon, Einar accompanied Torhild to a nearby settlement where a trader had broken his arm after slipping on the icy dock. The injury was swollen, red, and misshapen, the skin stretched thin and shiny. Torhild set her tools down beside him. A long, narrow knife, strips of softened leather, and a small clay pot filled with a thick, dark salve. She explained what she was going to do, but the man only nodded, his face pale. Einar watched as she used the leather to steady the arm and began pressing it into place. The man bit down on a piece of wood, a muffled groan escaping as Torhild worked. When the bone was aligned, she wrapped it tightly and smeared the salve along the skin to keep the swelling down. On the surface, it looked like skill and care, yet Einar felt a prickle on the back of his neck. There was no prayer to Freya for healing, no whispered thanks to Odin for guiding her hands. Torhild simply finished, packed up her tools, and left. Later, when Einar asked her why, she said softly that there wasn't time anymore for every ritual. Winter was hard. People were sick or injured every day, and the work had to be done quickly if they were to help everyone. Still, her eyes shifted when she spoke, as though she knew she was leaving something important behind. Meanwhile, the village's oldest healer, Esker, had begun avoiding Torhild. He said nothing openly, but Einar noticed the way his gaze followed her in the longhouse, the way his lips tightened when she prepared her tools. Esker still practiced the full rites, even if it took hours. He believed healing wasn't just about fixing the body, but about balancing the soul. Without balance, he said, a person could linger between life and death, a dangerous place for both the living and the dead. The unspoken conflict between Torhild and Esker seemed to stretch across the village like a thin sheet of ice, fragile, dangerous to tread on. People began choosing sides quietly, though they never admitted it aloud. Some believed Torhild's quicker, cleaner methods were the way forward, especially in hard times. Others whispered that Esker's old ways were safer for the spirit. And in between them were people like Einar, caught between respect for tradition and the pull of the new. That tension deepened when a boy named Sigurd fell ill with a strange fever. His skin burned to the touch, yet his breath came in shallow, rattling gasps. Torhild believed the sickness was in the blood and needed to be released. She took out her sharpest knife and said she would open a vein in his arm to let the sickness drain. But Esker stepped forward, blocking her, saying the boy's spirit was under attack by unseen forces. He wanted to burn sage, chant, and keep Sigurd warm until the fever broke naturally. They stood in silence for a moment, the only sound the boy's labored breathing. Einar could feel the eyes of the entire room watching, waiting to see what would happen. Finally, Sigurd's mother stepped forward and begged them both to work together. Torhild relented, setting her knife aside, but the way her jaw tightened told Einar this was far from over. Esker lit his herbs and began chanting, while Torhild prepared a drink of crushed willow bark to ease the fever. Sigurd survived the night, but the moment had left a crack in the healer's unity that would not easily mend. After that, strange things began to happen more often. Tools would go missing from Torhild's satchel, only to reappear days later in odd places. Herbs dried in Esker's hut would spoil faster than they should. And the dreams, those unsettling, shadow-filled dreams, spread through the village like frost creeping over a window pane. Some said it was the sickness lingering in people's bodies. Others whispered it was something older, something that had been woken by the changes in the healer's work. Einar couldn't help but feel caught in the middle. He admired Torhild's skill and her determination to save lives quickly, but he also respected Esker's deep understanding of the old ways. The more he watched, the more he realized this wasn't just about medicine. It was about what kind of future the village would choose. Would they hold on to the past, with its rituals and beliefs, or would they move towards something colder, sharper, and faster? The question hung in the air without an answer. And with each passing day, the line between healing and harm seemed to blur just a little more, leaving Einar to wonder what price they might pay if that line finally disappeared. Runa knew that time was running out. Her uncle's fever had risen through the night, and the deep gash on his leg had turned an angry shade of red, the swelling creeping further each hour. She had cleaned it the way her grandmother taught her, using a broth made from herbs she found in the marsh, but the heat in his skin told her it was not enough. Outside, the wind carried the sound of the sea, and with it came the faint roar of the waves striking against the cliffside, a reminder that in the world of the Vikings, nature gave and took without mercy. By the morning light, she made the decision to find Arn the old healer who lived beyond the hills. Arn was not trusted by everyone in the village. Some said he had learned his craft from distant lands, that he had once sailed with warriors who plundered monasteries in the west and brought back not only silver, but strange knowledge. Others whispered that he had studied with shamans in the north, trading sealskin and whale bone for secrets about the body and spirit. Whatever the truth, Arn had a reputation. He could save those who were on the edge, but his methods frightened people. The path to his home was long, winding through frost-covered grass and across streams glazed with thin ice. Runa's breath formed clouds in the cold air, her hands numb even under wool. As she walked, she remembered the stories told by the elders, how Viking medicine was not just about healing, but about survival in the harshest of worlds. A broken bone was not just pain. It could mean the loss of a season's work, a threat to the family's food supply, even death during the next raid if a warrior could not fight. This made their approach to healing urgent and unflinching. Runa reached Arn's hut by midday. Smoke curled lazily from the roof hole, and the smell of boiling herbs drifted toward her. She pushed open the rough wooden door and stepped into a dim interior. Arn sat hunched over a table, grinding something in a stone bowl. His hair was gray and wild, his eyes sharp despite the shadows. "You've come for help," he said without looking up. It wasn't a question. Runa hesitated, unsure if she should speak of her uncle's wound directly, but the urgency broke through her caution. She described the swelling, the fever, the smell she had noticed that morning. Arn listened silently, his hands still moving over the herbs. "You waited too long," he finally said, his voice low. "If the rot reaches the blood, there is no turning it back." His words landed like stones in her chest. "Bring him here," he added, "and bring strong men to carry him. We will see if the gods are willing to let him stay." That evening, Runa and 3 others carried her uncle to Arn's hut. He was barely conscious, his skin pale except for the flush of fever. Arn examined the wound under the flickering light of an oil lamp. The sight made even the strongest among them look away. Arn muttered something under his breath, words in a tongue Runa did not recognize. He gathered his tools, some familiar, like bone needles and smooth stones, others strange. Hooks of bronze, thin-bladed knives, and bundles of herbs that gave off sharp, bitter scents. He instructed Runa to hold her uncle's shoulders, while 2 others steadied his legs. Then he began to work. Viking's surgery was never gentle. Arn cleaned the wound with a hot infusion, the steam carrying the sharp scent of juniper and angelica. The liquid hissed as it touched the open flesh, and her uncle groaned despite his weakness. Arn then took a small, glowing piece of metal from the fire and pressed it to the edge of the wound. The smell of burning skin filled the air, and Runa's eyes watered. She wanted to look away, but forced herself to watch, knowing this was her uncle's only chance. Outside, the wind rattled the door, and the fire snapped inside the hearth. Arn worked with steady hands, his face calm as though the world beyond the wound did not exist. He scraped away dead flesh with a curved blade, his movements quick and precise. Then he stitched the wound closed with sinew, the thread glistening in the lamplight. When it was done, Arn sat back and wiped his hands on a cloth. "Now we wait," he said simply. He gave Runa a pouch of dried herbs. "Boil these in water and make him drink it every morning. It will keep the sickness from growing. But if his dreams turn dark and his words make no sense, then—" He did not finish the sentence. For the next days, Runa stayed by her uncle's side. She gave him the bitter drink, kept the fire burning, and prayed silently to the gods she wasn't even sure were listening. Arn visited once a day, checking the wound, sometimes adding more herbs, sometimes just sitting quietly. Each time, Runa searched his face for signs of hope, but he gave none. The days stretched, and Runa began to notice something strange. At night, her uncle whispered names she didn't know, describing places she had never seen. Once, he spoke of a hall of gold where warriors with half-healed wounds feasted together, and a woman with bright hair beckoned him to join them. She didn't know if this was a dream, a memory, or something else. On the 7th day, Arn came early in the morning. He checked the wound, his fingers pressing lightly against the swollen skin. His brows drew together, and for the first time, Runa thought she saw a flicker of doubt in his eyes. "It is better than it was," he said slowly, "but not yet safe. There is something still in him that should not be there." Runa asked what he meant, but Arn only shook his head. "We may have to open it again," he said. The thought made her stomach turn. Her uncle had survived the first ordeal, but could he survive another? The question hung in the air, unspoken but heavy, as Arn prepared his tools once more. And then, just as he reached the fire to heat the metal, there came a sudden knock on the door. Sharp, urgent, and unexpected. Runa froze, her uncle stirred in his sleep, and Arn's hand hovered above the flames. Whoever was outside, they had come at the worst possible moment. The day after the incident, the small town felt heavier than usual. People still went about their daily routines. Coffee brewed in kitchens, school buses rolled down cracked roads. But there was an undercurrent in every conversation, an unease no one wanted to name. At the diner, whispers replaced the usual clinking of forks against plates. Faces glanced toward the door each time it opened, as if expecting someone to walk in with answers. Rebecca sat in a corner booth with her coffee going cold. She'd been up most of the night, replaying the events in her head. Every small detail felt like it could be important, yet the more she thought about it, the more it felt like pieces of the puzzle were missing entirely. Navarro slid into the booth across from her, his own cup steaming in his hands. He didn't say hello, he just looked at her like they were both too tired to pretend everything was fine. "You think they've already decided how the story's going to be told?" Navarro asked quietly. Rebecca gave a faint, humorless smile. "They probably decided before it even happened." Navarro leaned forward, lowering his voice further. "The chief wants us off the case. Says it's been reassigned. But the people they're giving it to, they've got no history with this kind of thing. They won't ask questions. They'll just follow the paper trail until it's neat and harmless." Rebecca felt a slow burn rise in her chest. "That's the point, isn't it? No loose ends." They sat in silence for a moment, listening to the low hum of the diner's refrigerator. The waitress, sensing the weight of their conversation, didn't come over to refill their cups. Rebecca finally broke the stillness. "Navarro, last night after I got home, I thought I saw someone watching the house. Just a shadow at the end of the street. When I stepped outside, they were gone." Navarro's jaw tightened. "You think it's connected?" "I think nothing's a coincidence anymore." That day, while the official investigation took a sharp, bureaucratic turn toward closure, Rebecca and Navarro decided they weren't finished. They drove to the outskirts of town, following a lead that had been quietly dismissed in the official report. It led them to an abandoned property, its windows boarded up, the front porch sagging under years of neglect. Inside, dust floated in the stale air, and the smell of mildew hung heavy. But in the back room, under a tarp, they found something the official reports hadn't mentioned: a box of files, photographs, and handwritten notes. Some of the names they recognized. Locals, people who had vanished from the public eye without explanation. Others were strangers, but their faces were marked with dates and numbers. Rebecca picked up a photograph of a young woman. Her expression caught mid-laugh. A red marker line had been drawn across the bottom with a date scrawled beside it. Navarro glanced over her shoulder. That's 2 days before she disappeared. Rebecca's mind raced. These aren't just records. This is a timeline. As they dug deeper into the box, they found maps, some marked with strange symbols, others with precise coordinates. Every location was somewhere remote, hidden from plain sight. The most recent date was only a week old. They exchanged a look that said more than words could. Whoever was behind this wasn't finished. Driving back into town, Navarro kept checking the rearview mirror. Rebecca noticed, too, a black SUV keeping its distance, never getting close enough to read the plates. When they took a sudden turn down a side road, the SUV didn't follow. But the unease lingered. That night, Rebecca sat at her kitchen table, the files spread out before her. She could feel the weight of every photograph, every name. Somewhere in the middle of the stack, she found a sheet of paper folded twice over. Inside, written in uneven block letters, were the words, "You're already too close." She didn't sleep. The next morning, Navarro called. His voice was tight, urgent. "Rebecca, someone broke into my apartment last night. They didn't take anything, at least nothing obvious. But they went through my desk. They were looking for something." Rebecca's thoughts went immediately to the box of files. "We need to move them. Now." They met at an old storage unit on the edge of town, one Navarro had rented years ago for reasons he never explained. The place was quiet, tucked away behind a row of rusting shipping containers. They locked the files inside, knowing it was a temporary fix at best. As they left, Rebecca noticed a man leaning against a telephone pole across the street. He wasn't pretending not to watch them. He was making sure they saw him. The man didn't follow them when they drove away, but it was clear now. The investigation was no longer just about finding the truth. It was about staying ahead of whoever didn't want it found. Later that week, Rebecca tried to speak with one of the families connected to the missing names. The woman she visited, an older lady with tired eyes, shut the door as soon as Rebecca mentioned the case. "You don't understand," the woman said through the crack. "If you keep digging, you'll disappear too." Rebecca stood there for a long moment after the door closed, feeling the weight of the warning. By the time she got back to her car, Navarro had sent her a message. "We need to meet. Urgent." She didn't know it yet, but the next time she saw Navarro, everything they thought they understood about the case was about to shift, and not in a way either of them could control. The wind outside had picked up, rattling the loose shutters against the side of the old building. Inside, the air felt heavier than ever, thick with the unspoken tension that had been building for days. Everyone seemed to be moving with a sense of quiet urgency now, as if they knew something was about to happen but didn't want to admit it. The clock on the wall ticked louder than usual, marking each second like a warning. Rebecca stood near the far window, staring out into the dim streetlights that flickered in the distance. She wasn't just looking for movement, she was listening. Every faint noise outside, every creak of the floorboards above, made her pulse quicken. Somewhere out there, answers were waiting, but so were the people who didn't want those answers to be found. Navarro leaned over the table, the documents spread in front of him like puzzle pieces. "Something's wrong," he muttered, not even looking up. His voice was low, almost as if he was speaking to himself. Rebecca glanced over, catching the sharp lines in his face. He'd been running on coffee and stubborn willpower for too long, but that wasn't what unsettled her. It was the way he kept checking the same paper over and over, like he was hoping the words might change. "What is it?" she asked, finally walking over. He slid the file toward her without a word. Inside was a photo, grainy, slightly blurred, but clear enough to see the shape of a figure standing just out of the light. She recognized the place instantly. "That's the alley behind the safe house." He nodded. "Taken last night." The realization landed like a stone in her stomach. Someone had been watching them, close enough to hear, maybe close enough to follow. That meant every move they made from here on out would be shadowed. Meanwhile, across town, someone else was moving with equal precision. A man in a dark coat stepped out of a nondescript sedan, his face hidden under the brim of his cap. He didn't speak to the driver. He didn't look around. He just walked toward the edge of the street where the light didn't reach. In his hand was a small envelope, sealed and marked only with a single symbol, a circle with a slash through it. Back in the room, the hum of tension rose. Another team member, Harris, burst through the door, rain clinging to his jacket. "We've got a problem," he said between breaths. "The contact we were supposed to meet, he's gone. His place is trashed, and there's no sign of him." Rebecca's heart sank. Every lead they had was slipping away, one by one. But this wasn't random. It felt deliberate, like someone was moving the pieces off the board before they could be used. Navarro looked up sharply. "Gone as in missing, or gone as in someone made him disappear?" Harris didn't answer right away. The silence was enough. Rebecca sat down slowly, her mind racing. The deeper they went, the clearer it became. This wasn't just about uncovering the truth. It was about staying alive long enough to do it. But there was another layer, something they still couldn't name. Too many small details didn't add up. The coded notes, the strange gaps in official records, the way certain names kept surfacing in completely unrelated places. It was as if someone had built an entire web just to hide in plain sight. And then there was the figure in the photo, the one standing in the shadows. Navarro had zoomed in on the image earlier, trying to sharpen the features, but the best he could get was a faint outline of the face. Still, something about it had stuck in his mind. Now, as he stared at the wall, he realized what it was. He'd seen that same outline once before, years ago, on a case that was abruptly shut down without explanation. Back then, he thought it was just bad luck. Now, he wasn't so sure. Rebecca noticed his expression change. "What is it?" He hesitated. "If I'm right, then this isn't just about our case. It's about something that started a long time ago. And if that's true, we're in deeper than we thought." The room went quiet again, but this time it was a different kind of silence. Everyone could feel it, the slow tightening of the noose. Somewhere in the distance, a siren wailed and then faded. Rain began to tap against the windows, steady and cold. The city seemed to be holding its breath. Rebecca's phone buzzed on the table. One new message. No name, no number, just a string of coordinates and 3 words. "It's happening tonight." Her eyes met Navarro's, and in that moment they both understood. Everything they'd been chasing was about to collide in one place. And whatever was waiting for them, there would change everything. They had hours, maybe less, to decide whether to run toward it or try to survive another day. But deep down, Rebecca knew they weren't going to walk away. Not now. Not when the truth was finally within reach, no matter how dangerous it was. Outside, in the shadows across the street, the figure from the photo watched the safe house. Motionless. Waiting. The clock kept ticking. The rain began to fall harder, drumming against the roof of the small safe house like an impatient hand. Inside, the air was thick, heavy with tension. No one spoke for a long moment. The maps, files, and photographs spread across the table seemed to mock them with their unanswered questions. Every clue they had followed only led them deeper into a maze that twisted back on itself. They were close, too close, for comfort. Everyone could feel it, that prickling unease that comes when you know someone else is watching. Rebecca's gaze stayed fixed on the corner of one of the photographs. A blurry figure, caught in the background of a crowd shot, seemed to appear again in 3 other photos from completely different locations. Same build, same stance, same shadowed face. Navarro leaned over her shoulder, studying it. "That can't be coincidence," he muttered, voice low, as if speaking too loudly might draw that figure into the room. They'd been tracking this network for weeks, but the deeper they dug, the more it felt like the network was tracking them in return. Calls were being intercepted. Meetings were canceled without explanation. And last night, one of their contacts had simply vanished, leaving behind an apartment with the front door ajar, a half-drunk cup of coffee, still warm on the counter. The others, 2 agents and a local detective, watched from the far end of the table, each wearing the same strained expression. They had all signed up for this willingly, but now the weight of it was starting to show. This wasn't just about the case anymore. It was about survival. One wrong step, and they could all become pieces of someone else's puzzle. Navarro straightened, running a hand through his hair, restless. "We can't keep reacting," he said. "They're always a move ahead. We need to change the game." Rebecca didn't answer right away. She was remembering something an old mentor once told her, how sometimes the only way to catch the truth was to let it come to you. But that meant bait, and bait was dangerous. Outside, headlights swept across the window as a car passed slowly. Everyone tensed. The sound of the tires on wet pavement lingered a beat too long before fading. The detective moved to the window and pulled the curtain just enough to glance out. Nothing, but the unease remained. Rebecca finally spoke. "If we go forward, we go all in. No half measures. We need every lead, every pattern, every connection laid out. And we need to accept that someone in this chain may not be who they say they are." The words landed heavily. She didn't have to explain further. Everyone understood what she meant. The room seemed smaller now, the walls pressing in. Navarro started pacing, outlining a rough plan. It was risky, and it hinged on their ability to flush out whoever was pulling the strings without tipping them off. The detective suggested a decoy operation, something to draw attention in one direction while they worked quietly in another. But the problem with that kind of plan was simple. If the decoy went wrong, it would go wrong very publicly. While the discussion unfolded, Rebecca kept glancing at the photographs. That shadowy figure still bothered her, not because she thought it was the leader, but because it felt like a warning. Someone had wanted them to notice. And if that was the case, then the game they were playing was even more dangerous than they'd imagined. By the time they broke for a brief pause, the storm had intensified. Lightning flashed, illuminating the room for a split second, and in that flash, Rebecca thought she saw something, a reflection in the darkened glass. She turned sharply, but there was only her own face staring back. Still, her pulse quickened. Navarro came over, speaking quietly. "You saw it too, didn't you?" He didn't wait for an answer. "They're here. Maybe not in the room, but close enough to remind us." The team regrouped, this time with a more urgent tone. They marked possible meeting points, escape routes, and fallback locations. Every move they made from here on had to be precise. One misstep and they wouldn't get a second chance. As the night dragged on, the safe house seemed to grow colder. The hum of the refrigerator, the ticking of the wall clock, every sound was magnified in the silence between sentences. Outside, the storm showed no sign of letting up. Somewhere beyond the rain and darkness, the people they were chasing, and the ones chasing them, were moving, planning, waiting. By the time they finally settled on their next steps, exhaustion was etched into everyone's faces. But no one was ready to sleep. Sleep meant lowering your guard, and lowering your guard here was an invitation for trouble. Rebecca stood by the window, staring into the black night, her breath fogging the glass. She knew the climax was coming, and it was coming fast. The question was, who would still be standing when it hit? The night air felt heavy, like the weight of what was coming had settled over the whole town. Every corner seemed darker than usual, every sound sharper, every shadow longer. People kept glancing over their shoulders as if they could feel trouble getting closer, even if they couldn't see it. In the small diner on the edge of town, the regulars sat quieter than normal, the clinking of cups and the hum of the refrigerator filling the space where laughter and conversation usually lived. It wasn't just fear, it was the knowing that something was about to break. Rebecca sat in the back booth, her eyes scanning the parking lot through the window. She stirred her coffee without drinking it, her mind caught in a loop of everything she had learned in the last few days. Every lead seemed to pull her deeper into a maze, and every turn revealed another locked door. Somewhere in all of this was the truth, but it was buried under layers of lies, old grudges, and the kind of silence that only came from people who were scared to speak. Navarro slid into the seat across from her, his expression serious. "He's moving," he said quietly, leaning in so no one could overhear. Rebecca didn't ask who. She already knew. The man they'd been circling for weeks was finally making a move, and whatever it was, wasn't going to be small. Navarro placed a folded piece of paper on the table and pushed it toward her. It was a list, names, dates, locations. Some were familiar, others she had never heard before. But one thing was clear, these weren't random. They were connected, and at the center was the man who had been playing this game longer than anyone realized. She felt the knot in her stomach tighten. "How sure are you?" she asked. "Sure enough to know we don't have time," Navarro replied. His tone was calm, but his eyes betrayed the urgency. "If we wait, we're going to lose the chance to stop him. And if we lose that chance, people are going to get hurt." Rebecca's mind raced. Every instinct told her this was the moment they'd been waiting for, but the risk was bigger than anything they'd faced so far. The closer they got, the more dangerous it became, not just for them, but for anyone caught in the crossfire. The man they were after didn't make mistakes. He didn't leave trails unless he wanted someone to follow them. Out on the streets, the night seemed to move faster. A black SUV rolled past the diner, slowing just enough to make Navarro notice. He gave a small nod toward the window, and Rebecca's hand instinctively went to the inside of her jacket. The SUV kept going, disappearing into the dark, but the unease it left behind stayed with them. Navarro tapped the list again. These locations, he's staging something. He's pulling people in from different places. Could be a meeting, could be a trade. But it's happening soon. Rebecca didn't respond right away. Her eyes lingered on one of the names near the bottom of the list. She knew it. Someone who had vanished years ago without explanation. If this was real, it meant that person wasn't gone. Or, at least, they hadn't been when this list was made. The thought sent a chill through her. They left the diner together, the cold wind hitting them as soon as the door swung open. The town was quiet, but the kind of quiet that felt staged, as if the world was holding its breath. Rebecca glanced down the street, catching sight of a figure slipping into an alley. It was too quick to make out details, but something about the movement stuck with her. Navarro noticed it too. "You thinking what I'm thinking?" he asked. "Only one way to find out," she replied. They followed the alley, the sound of their footsteps echoing against the brick walls. Somewhere in the distance, a door slammed. The figure was gone, but in its place they found a single envelope lying on the wet pavement. Navarro picked it up, tearing it open. Inside was a single photograph, grainy, black and white, but unmistakable. It was the warehouse on the outskirts of town, and in the corner of the image, barely visible, was the man they'd been chasing. Rebecca stared at it, her pulse quickening. Whoever had left this wanted them to see it. Whether it was a warning or a trap, she couldn't tell. But the warehouse was now their only lead, and time was running out. By the time they reached the outskirts, clouds had moved in, covering the moon and leaving the road in darkness. The warehouse loomed ahead, a massive shape against the sky, its windows dark and lifeless. But Rebecca knew better. Places like this never looked alive from the outside. It was inside where the danger waited. They parked a few blocks away and approached on foot, staying in the shadows. The wind carried the faint sound of voices, low, muffled, but urgent. Rebecca and Navarro exchanged a glance. The air smelled faintly of oil and rust, and the ground was littered with broken glass that crunched under their shoes. Every step brought them closer to the heart of whatever was unfolding inside. Just as they reached the side of the building, a sudden burst of light flashed from one of the windows, followed by the sound of metal hitting the floor. Someone inside shouted, and then the voices rose, overlapping, tense. Rebecca pressed her back against the wall, her hand tightening around her weapon. Navarro leaned toward her. "We need eyes inside," he whispered. She nodded, scanning for an entry point. A rusted fire escape clung to the side of the building like a skeleton, leading up to a second-floor window. It didn't look stable, but it was the only option. They moved quickly, the metal groaning under their weight as they climbed. When they reached the top, Rebecca peered through the dirty glass. Inside, she could see a group of people gathered around a table. Papers were spread out, along with maps and what looked like old photographs. At the head of the table was the man they'd been chasing, calm, composed, and completely in control. He spoke slowly, gesturing to the maps as the others listened. But what caught her attention was the small locked case on the table. Whatever was inside, it was the reason everyone was here tonight. Navarro leaned closer to get a better look, but just then, one of the men inside turned toward the window. Rebecca ducked, her heart pounding. She waited, listening for any sign they'd been spotted, but the voices continued as before. She knew they couldn't stay like this for long. The clock was ticking, and every second brought them closer to the moment everything would either fall apart or explode. The silence that followed was heavier than anything they had experienced before. Everyone in the room seemed frozen, unsure if they had just heard what they thought they did. Rebecca's eyes darted toward Navarro, and she saw the same flicker of disbelief mirrored in his face. The name the man had just whispered was impossible, someone they had ruled out months ago, someone who, by every official record, was not even alive anymore. The implication clawed at the back of Rebecca's mind. If it was true, it would mean they had been chasing the wrong trail entirely, and whoever was behind this had been one step ahead from the start. Navarro leaned in, his voice low, trying not to betray his own shock. "Say that again," he demanded, but the man only shook his head weakly, muttering something about them watching and it not being safe here. Rebecca knew that if they pushed too hard now, he might shut down completely. But if they backed off, they risked losing the one person who seemed to know the truth. the tension between urgency and caution pressed down like a vice. Outside the safe house, a sudden screech of tires shattered the stillness. Navarro's hand instinctively went to his weapon, but Rebecca grabbed his arm, pulling him toward the window. Across the street, a dark sedan had stopped just long enough for someone inside to take a single photograph of the house before speeding away. It wasn't a random car. They had been found, and whoever was pulling the strings wanted them to know it. The man at the table had gone pale, eyes darting toward the door. "You don't understand," he said, voice trembling. "If they know I spoke to you, I'm finished. And so are you." His warning felt less like paranoia and more like a fact. Rebecca could almost feel the invisible net tightening around them. She glanced at Navarro, and he gave a small nod. They both knew they had to move fast. But before they could leave, the man leaned forward, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's not just him. There's someone on the inside, higher than you think. That's how they always stay ahead." Rebecca felt her stomach drop. This wasn't just about a hidden figure in the shadows anymore. It was about betrayal from within. Someone close to their investigation was feeding information to the other side, making every step they took part of a bigger trap. They made the decision to relocate immediately. The safe house no longer felt safe, and staying there another second felt like inviting disaster. Navarro grabbed the files, Rebecca took the encrypted drive, and they moved the informant toward the back door. But as they stepped into the narrow alley, Rebecca caught a glimpse of movement on the rooftop opposite them. It was just a silhouette, barely visible against the darkening sky, but the angle was wrong for it to be a passerby. Someone was watching, waiting. The rush to the car was tense and silent, broken only by the informant's ragged breathing. Once inside, Navarro floored the accelerator, weaving through side streets in an attempt to lose any possible tail. But Rebecca couldn't shake the feeling that it didn't matter how far they ran. Whoever was behind this had already planned their next move. 2 miles out, Navarro pulled into an underground parking garage and cut the engine. "We need to talk," he said, turning to face Rebecca. "If there's a leak, it's not just our operation that's compromised. It's the whole chain. Every agent, every witness." His words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of what that meant. Before Rebecca could respond, the informant spoke again, this time with a sharpness in his tone. "You think this is just about one case? You're not seeing the whole picture. This goes back years. There's money, deals, disappearances. And every time someone gets close, they vanish. Sometimes it looks like an accident. Sometimes they just stop existing." His eyes locked with Rebecca's, and for a moment, she thought she saw genuine fear there, not just for himself, but for them. Navarro ran a hand over his face. "We need proof," he muttered. "Names, dates, anything we can take to someone we can trust." But that was the problem. They didn't know who they could trust anymore. Every ally could be a double agent. Every piece of intel a carefully planted misdirection. Then the informant said something that made both of them go still. "The second file. You haven't opened it yet, have you?" Rebecca frowned. She had seen the second encrypted partition on the drive, but hadn't accessed it, assuming it was a backup. "Open it," the man urged. "But do it somewhere no one can hear." That file changed everything. The moment Rebecca saw the first image, her pulse quickened. Photographs of people who had nothing to do with each other, at least on paper, but all of them had one thing in common. They were tied to operations that had been shut down without explanation. Some were whistleblowers, others suspects who had turned informants. And every single one of them was either dead or missing. In the middle of the file was a photograph that froze Rebecca in place. She recognized the face instantly. An agent who had been her mentor years ago, someone she thought had been killed in an unrelated accident. But here he was, alive, standing next to the very man they believed to be the central figure in their investigation. It wasn't just a shock. It was a betrayal of everything she thought she knew. The more they scrolled, the more the truth unraveled. This wasn't about one criminal network. It was about a hidden structure that had been influencing investigations for decades, controlling which cases succeeded, which failed, and who was allowed to survive long enough to testify. Navarro looked at Rebecca, his expression grim. "We're not hunting them," he said quietly. They've been hunting us since day one. That realization was the second twist they never saw coming. Everything they had done so far, every lead they thought they had uncovered, had been part of a carefully crafted game, and they had been moving exactly where their unseen opponent wanted them. The stakes weren't just high now, they were catastrophic, and the clock was running out. Rebecca felt the weight of that truth settling in. They weren't just up against a dangerous man. They were up against an entire system designed to bury the truth before it could ever see daylight. And now, they had just enough information to make them the next targets. The sound of footsteps echoed in the garage, pulling them back into the present. Someone was coming, and by the rhythm, it wasn't just one person. The footsteps echoed louder, growing closer with every second, sharp and deliberate against the cold concrete of the garage. Rebecca's heart hammered in her chest, the tension tightening like a noose around her throat. Navarro moved instinctively, pulling his weapon from his jacket with a fluid motion. The informant, pale and shaking, sank lower into the back seat, clutching the files like a lifeline. The dim light flickered overhead as three figures emerged from the shadows, their faces obscured by hoods and scarves. They moved with quiet confidence, the kind born from knowing they had the advantage. Navarro's eyes locked on them, calculating the odds. "Stay calm," Navarro whispered to Rebecca. "We might have a chance to talk this out." The lead figure stepped forward, lowering his hood to reveal a face that sent a chill through Rebecca's spine. It was someone she recognized, a senior agent from a rival division, one she trusted once, but who had become increasingly distant and secretive over the past months. His cold gaze fixed on them, unreadable and dangerous. "You shouldn't have come here," he said quietly but with undeniable authority. Rebecca's mind raced. This wasn't just a raid or a casual warning. This was a power move, a signal that the shadows she and Navarro were chasing extended deep into the very institutions meant to protect them. The senior agent stepped inside the garage, nodding to his companions. "Drop the files," he commanded. Navarro's finger twitched on the trigger, but Rebecca held his arm. She knew a firefight would end badly for all of them. "We need answers," she said, voice steady despite the adrenaline. The agent smiled thinly. "Answers? You're tangled in something much bigger than you know. Those files? They're not just evidence. They're Pandora's box." He moved closer, the light casting harsh shadows across his face. "You have no idea how many lives depend on this remaining buried." Rebecca's eyes narrowed. "Then why are you here? To protect the truth or to bury it?" The agent's expression flickered for a moment, something almost like regret, before hardening again. "I'm here to stop you from making a mistake that could cost us all." Suddenly, the garage doors began to seal shut with a mechanical grind, trapping them inside. Navarro cursed under his breath and aimed at the control panel, but before he could fire, a sharp click sounded, a silenced shot that pierced the air, striking the panel and plunging the garage into darkness. Panic flickered across the group's faces, but Rebecca forced herself to stay calm. She switched on the flashlight from her phone, its beam cutting through the blackness. The informant gasped, clutching his chest where the cold air seemed to bite. The senior agent's voice came from the dark, calm and controlled. "You're cornered now. Surrender the files, and maybe there's a way out of this for you." Rebecca exchanged a glance with Navarro. There was no way they were giving up the evidence they had painstakingly gathered. Not now. A tense silence settled. Then, from the shadows, a new voice spoke. A woman's voice, sharp and commanding. "You underestimate them," she said, stepping into the light. It was the informant's voice, but transformed, strong and determined. She pulled out a concealed device from her coat and pressed a button. A sudden series of beeps echoed through the garage, and the doors began to slowly open. The senior agent's face twisted with anger and surprise. "What?" But before he could finish, Rebecca lunged forward, grabbing the informant's arm. "Who are you really?" she demanded. The woman's eyes held a fierce clarity. Someone who refuses to let this end in silence. As the garage doors rolled up, the rain had stopped, but the storm within was far from over. Rebecca and Navarro knew one thing with certainty now. The fight for the truth was only just beginning, and the enemy was closer than ever. The garage doors slid open with a low groan, spilling the wet night air into the tense space where shadows and secrets had collided moments before. The woman, the informant they thought was fragile, now moved with fierce purpose, her every step measured and sure. Rebecca watched her carefully, aware that trust was a fragile thing in this tangled web, and every ally might hide a deeper truth. Navarro eased his grip on the weapon, but kept it ready. The senior agent, still standing by the edge of the opening, scanned the street beyond as if weighing the risks of what lay ahead. "This isn't over," he muttered, voice tight but tinged with reluctant respect. Rebecca stepped forward, eyes sharp. "No, it's just beginning. You said the files were Pandora's box. Now we're here. Do you know what you're really protecting?" The agent didn't answer. Instead, he turned abruptly and disappeared into the shadows, leaving a trail of cold air behind him. The rain had stopped, but the streets shimmered wet and cold, reflecting the dim glow of street lamps. The woman, whose real name they still didn't know, pulled Rebecca aside. "You need to understand the system you're up against. This isn't just one man or one agency. It's a network embedded everywhere. They decide who lives, who dies, and whose stories get buried." Rebecca listened, absorbing every word, but a creeping dread settled in her chest. The deeper the truth went, the more dangerous it became. "We have to move fast," Navarro said, pulling out a map marked with coordinates. "The next meeting is in less than 12 hours. If we want to stop this, we have to be there." The informant nodded. "And not just stop it, but expose it to the world." They planned their approach carefully, knowing the risks. The warehouse, the heart of this hidden operation, was a fortress guarded by more than just walls. It was protected by layers of deception, influence, and fear. As they drove toward the location, the weight of everything pressed on them. Rebecca's mind raced through every detail. The missing people, the whispers of betrayal, the files that held secrets no one wanted revealed. She wondered how many had already fallen, victims to the system's silence. Navarro broke the silence. "We're not just chasing shadows anymore. They know who we are. They want to make sure we disappear." Rebecca glanced at him. "Then we make sure they don't get the chance." At the edge of the warehouse district, the city lights faded, replaced by looming shadows and silence that seemed to swallow sound. The building was larger than they expected, its windows dark, the air thick with the smell of rust and oil. They moved carefully, sticking to the shadows, avoiding cameras and patrols. Inside, faint voices echoed, a mix of urgent whispers and cold commands. Every step deeper into the building felt like stepping into a trap, but retreat wasn't an option. Suddenly, a voice crackled through Navarro's earpiece. "You're not alone. They've known about your moves since yesterday." Rebecca froze. The informant's eyes narrowed. Someone inside. Someone watching. They pressed on, hearts pounding, every sense alert. In a back room, they found a cluster of documents spread out. Plans, coded messages, lists of names. Some familiar, others shocking. The truth was bigger than anyone imagined. Then came the sudden noise, a door slamming shut, footsteps rushing toward them. Rebecca spun, weapon drawn. The shadows shifted, revealing a figure stepping forward. It was someone Rebecca had trusted, someone she never suspected. Betrayal was no longer just a threat. It had a face. The tension shattered into chaos as alliances cracked, and the true fight for survival began. The sudden appearance of the figure sent a jolt through Rebecca's spine, a mixture of shock, disbelief, and raw betrayal. It was Jensen, a trusted colleague who had been with the agency for over a decade, someone Rebecca had worked alongside in countless investigations. His face was hard, eyes cold, and in his hand gleamed a pistol pointed directly at them. "You should have stayed out of this," Jensen said, his voice steady but carrying an edge that froze the air between them. Rebecca's mind raced, trying to process the impossibility of this moment. "Why, Jensen? After everything, why turn on us now?" His lips curled into a thin, bitter smile. "Because loyalty only goes so far. There are bigger forces at play. You're pawns in a game you don't understand." Navarro shifted closer to Rebecca, his weapon still trained on Jensen, ready for any sudden movement. The informant, now visibly shaken, took a cautious step back. "We trusted you," Rebecca said, her voice barely above a whisper, the hurt bleeding through the words. "How long have you been working against us?" Jensen's eyes flickered with something almost like regret, but his resolve didn't waver. "Long enough. You were close, but not close enough. The network protects itself, and so will I." The room tightened around them. Every option felt like a trap. Surrendering meant handing over the files and everything they'd fought for. Fighting risked everything, especially with Jensen's insider knowledge. Suddenly, the lights flickered and went out, plunging the warehouse into near-total darkness. Only the faint red glow of emergency exit signs offered any illumination. Rebecca's breath caught. Navarro cursed under his breath, trying to switch on his flashlight, but the device slipped from his fingers and clattered to the floor. From the shadows, voices whispered, faint but growing louder, the unmistakable sound of reinforcements arriving. This wasn't just Jensen's betrayal. It was a coordinated strike. "Get ready," Navarro growled. "They're coming." The three of them moved toward the nearest exit, hearts pounding. Rebecca clutched the encrypted drive tight, her mind a whirlwind of fear and determination. As they edged through narrow corridors, the sounds of footsteps multiplied, closing in fast. The stale air was heavy with dust and anticipation. Rebecca's phone buzzed in her pocket. A message flashed on the screen: "Trust no one." Her skin prickled. The warning was clear. Whoever had sent it knew far more than they did. They turned a corner and came face to face with a barricade of armed men, blocking the way forward. "Split up," Navarro hissed. "I'll take the left. Rebecca, you go right." The tension snapped. Rebecca sprinted down the right corridor, the echo of gunfire behind her. She ducked behind crates, heart hammering, and fired back blindly, the noise deafening. Up ahead, a steel door loomed, the exit to freedom, or so she hoped. Just as she reached it, a heavy hand grabbed her arm, spinning her around. Jensen, his gun pressed to her temple. "This ends here," he said softly. But before Rebecca could react, a shot rang out from behind, and Jensen staggered, releasing her. Navarro appeared, his weapon smoking. "Run," he urged. Together, they burst through the door into the storm-drenched night. The rain washed over them as they ran, adrenaline fueling their escape. Behind them, shouts and gunfire faded into the distance. They didn't stop until the warehouse was a shadow, swallowed by the darkness. Breathless and soaked, they collapsed behind a wall, the weight of what had just happened pressing down. Rebecca looked at Navarro, her voice steady despite the chaos. "We have the files. We have the proof. But now, the real fight begins." Navarro nodded grimly. "And now, we know who the enemy really is." The storm was far from over, and the night was only just beginning. The rain didn't let up as Rebecca and Navarro leaned against the cold brick wall, their bodies aching from the adrenaline and exhaustion. The files they carried felt heavier than any weight they'd ever known, loaded with secrets that could topple powerful institutions. But the betrayal stung worse. Jensen's face haunted Rebecca's thoughts, a reminder that the enemy wasn't always easy to spot. "We can't go back," Navarro said quietly, breaking the silence. "Not until we know who else is compromised." Jensen was just one piece of a much larger puzzle. Rebecca nodded, swallowing the bitterness rising in her throat. "We need a safe place. Somewhere off the grid." The informant, still shaken but resolute, checked his watch. "There's an old cabin out by the river. No cameras, no connections. We can lay low and sift through what we have." The journey there was tense and silent, every shadow seeming to stretch and flicker like a threat. When they arrived, the cabin's worn wooden exterior looked like something out of a forgotten story, the windows dark and empty. Inside, the faint smell of damp wood mixed with the mustiness of disuse. They set to work immediately, spreading out the files and encrypted drives on a battered table. Rebecca's fingers trembled slightly as she began decrypting the second partition, the one that had revealed so much already. Page after page revealed names, dates, financial transactions, evidence of a network so deep it was almost impossible to unravel. There were links between government officials, law enforcement, and shadowy figures operating beyond the law. Whistleblowers silenced, investigations shut down, lies erased. Navarro rubbed his eyes. This goes beyond anything we expected. It's systemic. It's corruption at every level. Rebecca looked up, her voice steady but filled with a grim determination. We have to get this out. To the public. To the press. Someone has to know. The informant shook his head. If we leak this without protection, we'll be silenced before the ink dries. They have eyes everywhere. The weight of the decision pressed down on them all. The truth could save lives, but it could also put them directly in the crosshairs of a powerful enemy who had already proven they wouldn't hesitate to kill. A sudden knock at the cabin door jolted them. Hearts pounding, they exchanged worried glances. Navarro moved to the window, peering through the rain-streaked glass. No one was there. Rebecca opened the door cautiously, the cold night air swirling inside. On the doorstep lay a single envelope, heavy, with no markings. She picked it up and carefully slid it open. Inside was a note, written in hurried, sharp handwriting. Trust no one. The next move will decide everything. The message left no room for doubt. The game had changed. As the night deepened, they pored over the files again, trying to piece together the final moves. The more they uncovered, the clearer it became that the network had a plan in motion, a move so bold and ruthless it threatened to destroy everything they fought for. They were running out of time. Rebecca's phone buzzed again. Another encrypted message appeared on the screen. Meet at the pier. Midnight. Come alone. No signature. No explanation. The three exchanged looks, weighing the risks. Rebecca's voice was firm. This could be a trap, or the last chance to turn the tide. Navarro sighed. If we don't take it, we lose everything. But if we do, we could lose more than we're ready for. The informant nodded. I'll cover you. Stay safe. As midnight approached, Rebecca found herself standing alone on the deserted pier, the cold wind biting through her jacket. The fog hung thick over the water, swallowing the lights and turning the world into shadows and whispers. Every nerve screamed caution, but she knew this meeting was a crossroads. The truth and the danger were intertwined here, and whatever happened next would change the course of everything. From the mist, a figure emerged, stepping into the faint glow of a distant street lamp. Rebecca's heart raced. She reached slowly into her pocket, fingers closing around the small recorder she'd hidden. "Who are you?" she asked, voice steady but cautious. The figure stepped closer, pulling back the hood to reveal a face she never expected to see, a face she thought had been lost to the past. The revelation cracked the night open like lightning. Rebecca's breath hitched as the figure stepped fully into the dim light, the cold mist swirling around them like a shroud. Her eyes locked onto a face she thought she'd never see again, the face of her former mentor, Agent Larson, the man who had vanished years ago under mysterious circumstances, whose disappearance had haunted her career ever since. "Larson," she whispered, hardly daring to believe it. He nodded slowly, his expression worn but resolute. "I've been watching, waiting for the right moment. You're closer than anyone's ever been." The wind carried the distant sound of waves crashing, the world feeling impossibly vast and yet painfully small at that moment. Rebecca's mind reeled. How was this possible? How had he survived, and why had he stayed hidden for so long? He looked at her with tired eyes. "The network you're fighting, it's deeper and darker than you imagined. They forced me into silence, but I never stopped working from the shadows. The files you have, they're the key to exposing everything. But there's one final piece missing." Rebecca's heart pounded. What piece? Before Larson could answer, headlights flashed at the edge of the pier. A black SUV pulled up, tires crunching on gravel. Out stepped several armed men, their faces cold and unyielding. The network's enforcers had found them. Larson's face hardened. "They won't let us leave easily." Rebecca and Larson exchanged a glance. This was the moment their entire mission had been leading to. They moved quickly, darting toward the edge of the pier where an old boat rocked gently against its moorings. Navarro's voice crackled in Rebecca's earpiece, urgent and strained. "Backup is 5 minutes out. Hold on." The armed men closed in, shouting orders. Rebecca's pulse surged, adrenaline sharpening every sense. She pulled Larson behind a stack of crates as bullets pinged against the metal. They fought tooth and nail, every second a battle for survival. The boat was their only hope. Navarro appeared suddenly, covering their escape with precise shots. Together, they scrambled onto the vessel, engines sputtering to life as the assailants closed in. The boat sped away, cutting through the black water, leaving danger behind, but not the weight of what they carried. As they caught their breath, Larson handed Rebecca a small, sealed envelope. "This contains proof beyond the files, testimonies, recordings, enough to bring the entire network down." She took it, her hands trembling. "We finally have what we need." But just as relief began to settle, Navarro's phone buzzed with a new message. "You think it's over? Look closer. The real puppeteer wears a mask." Rebecca's eyes widened. She looked at Larson, then at Navarro. The final twist wasn't just that the network existed. It was that its true leader was someone no one had suspected. The boat's engine hummed beneath them as the night closed in, the fight for justice far from finished. The boat cut through the dark waters, the steady hum of the engine the only sound as the shore slipped away behind them. Rebecca held the sealed envelope tight, her mind swirling with everything they had uncovered: the betrayals, the network, the shadowy figures pulling strings from behind the scenes. Yet Navarro's last message lingered, casting a new shadow over their hard-won progress. "You think it's over? Look closer. The real puppeteer wears a mask." The words echoed in Rebecca's mind, heavy and ominous. She glanced at Larson, whose expression had turned grave. "We thought we knew who was behind this," Rebecca said quietly. "But there's more." Larson nodded slowly. "Much more. The network you uncovered was just a branch, a front to hide the true power. The puppeteer controls not only the network, but parts of the very system we serve. That person is playing a long game, manipulating every piece on the board." Navarro frowned, gripping the steering wheel tighter. "Who?" Larson's eyes scanned the horizon, the faint glow of city lights distant but unreachable. "Someone trusted, someone respected, someone above suspicion." Rebecca swallowed hard. The weight of those words sank deep. It wasn't just about corrupt officials or rogue agents. It was about the very core of the institution they had devoted their lives to protecting. The betrayal was far more personal and dangerous than any of them had imagined. As the boat neared a secluded dock, Navarro slowed the engine. The night air was cold and biting, but Rebecca felt the heat of determination rising within her. They had come too far to stop now. They climbed onto the dock silently, the only footprints their own marking the wet wood. The envelope felt heavier than ever in Rebecca's hands, the knowledge inside holding the power to change everything or destroy them. The informant, still with them despite the chaos, pulled a small device from his coat and handed it to Rebecca. "This is a secure line to a trusted journalist, someone who can expose the truth without risking immediate silence." Rebecca nodded, the plan crystallizing. "We send everything. Then we prepare for what comes next." They made their way to an old safe house on the edge of the city, a place off any official grid, hidden and quiet. There, surrounded by flickering monitors and whispered conversations, they began the painstaking work of piecing together the evidence. The files, the recordings, the testimonies, they were all here, and they told a story of greed, power, and fear that reached far beyond what anyone had dared imagine. Yet, as the hours passed, a creeping sense of unease settled over Rebecca. The puzzle pieces fit, but a few edges still didn't quite line up. A name here, a date there, small inconsistencies that hinted at yet another layer of deception. Then, late in the night, Navarro received an encrypted message. The sender was anonymous, but the content was clear and chilling. "Stop digging, or you'll be the next to disappear." The threat was unmistakable. The enemy was watching, waiting, and willing to do whatever it took to protect their secrets. Rebecca stared at the message long after the others had gone to rest. The storm outside had picked up, rain pounding against the windows like a warning. Her phone buzzed again. A video this time. It showed a familiar office, the agency's own headquarters, empty except for a single desk. On that desk lay a photograph of her and Navarro, taken without their knowledge. The caption was simple, terrifying. "We see you." Her heart pounded. The walls between them and their enemies were thinner than ever. They weren't just fighting a hidden network. They were fighting an invisible enemy inside their own ranks. The next morning, with the dawn barely breaking, Rebecca, Navarro, Larson, and the informant gathered once more. The decision was unanimous. They had to go public. The risks were enormous, but silence was no longer an option. With trembling hands, Rebecca sent the encrypted files and recordings to the journalist's secure line. The moment the send button was pressed, a wave of fear and hope washed over her. The truth was no longer theirs alone. It belonged to everyone. Minutes later, the journalist replied with a simple message. "This will change everything." But before they could celebrate, the power flickered and died. The room plunged into darkness, illuminated only by the glow of their screens. Outside, sirens wailed, a distant but growing sound of approaching danger. They were running out of time. The final twist was still waiting. Suddenly, the informant stepped forward, his face hardening. "There's one more thing. The person you think is the puppeteer, they're a distraction." Rebecca's eyes widened. "What do you mean?" He reached into his coat and pulled out a small flash drive. "This contains the real master key, the evidence that will expose the true leader. But it's encrypted with the highest level security. Only one person can unlock it." "Who?" Navarro asked, his voice tense. "The one person none of us expected. The one wearing the mask." Rebecca swallowed hard. The fight wasn't over. It was only just beginning. And the real enemy was still out there, watching and waiting. The rain continued to fall, washing the city clean, but leaving its darkest secrets untouched. The horrors they had uncovered were not just stories of corruption and betrayal. They were warnings. And Rebecca knew this was far from the end. The weight of the flash drive in the informant's hand seemed to fill the room with a heavy silence. Everyone's eyes locked onto it, understanding immediately that this small piece of technology could either save them or doom them. Rebecca felt her chest tighten. For months, they had chased shadows, fought ghosts in the dark, and faced betrayals that cut deeper than any wound. Now, at the very edge of everything, the true face of the enemy was still hidden behind a mask. She took a deep breath, steadying herself. "If only one person can unlock it," she said slowly, "then that means we need that person, whoever they are." Navarro nodded, his jaw clenched. "But if the puppeteer has been careful enough to hide this key with one person, it means that person is as dangerous as the network itself." Larson stepped forward, his face etched with lines of weariness and hard-earned wisdom. "The stakes have never been higher. We need to find that person before they find us." The informant glanced at them, eyes sharp and wary. "I know who it is, and I know where to find them." Rebecca felt a flicker of hope. "Then we don't waste any more time." The plan was swift but perilous. Under the cloak of darkness, they prepared to move toward a location the informant called the Vault, a fortified, underground bunker where the key was kept under the tightest security. It was the last known refuge of the true puppeteer's lieutenant, the keeper of the master key. As they traveled, the city around them seemed to hold its breath. Every streetlight flickered uncertainly. Every shadow stretched longer, as if the night itself was warning them of what lay ahead. Rebecca's thoughts were a whirlwind. Who was this person? A traitor? A victim? Or something far worse? Arriving at the location, a nondescript building that could have been a warehouse or a bunker, they moved cautiously. The tension was palpable. The informant disabled the external security system with a series of precise commands. The locks clicked open, and they slipped inside. Inside, the air was cold and sterile, filled with the hum of machinery and the faint scent of ozone. The walls were lined with monitors, some flickering, others showing feed from distant locations. This was a command center, a nerve hub for the puppeteers' operations. At the heart of the room sat a lone figure, back turned to them. The figure's shoulders were broad, and their posture unyielding. When they finally turned, the room seemed to shrink. Rebecca's breath caught. The face before them was someone she knew intimately, someone who had been by her side through years of service, a person she had trusted more than anyone, her longtime partner, Agent Carter. His eyes were cold, calculating. "I wonder when you'd get here," Carter said, voice low but edged with something dangerous. "You think you're the heroes, but you've been pawns in my game all along." Rebecca staggered back, disbelief washing over her. "Carter, why?" He smiled, a chilling, hollow smile. "Why? Because power isn't given. It's taken. The network, the puppeteer, that's me. And you just played your final move." The room shifted into chaos. Navarro reached for his weapon, but Carter was faster, moving with a precision that only years of training could grant. The tension exploded into a desperate fight for survival. Rebecca ducked behind a console, heart pounding. This wasn't just about uncovering corruption anymore. It was about escaping a man who had been hiding in plain sight, manipulating everything. Larson tackled Carter from behind, but Carter twisted, breaking free and knocking Larson to the floor. The fight was brutal, each blow carrying the weight of years of betrayal. Finally, Rebecca saw her chance. She lunged forward, grabbing a heavy metal rod and striking Carter's side. He grunted, stunned. Navarro tackled him to the ground, pinning his arms. Breathless, Rebecca stared into Carter's eyes, searching for any sign of the man she once knew. Instead, she found only the cold, ruthless gaze of a man who had wore a mask for too long. "You don't understand," Carter spat. "I did what I had to. This world is built on secrets and lies. I control the lies." Rebecca shook her head, voice trembling but firm. "You lost sight of the truth. That's what we're fighting for." As the authorities finally arrived, alerted by their earlier transmissions, Carter was taken away, his empire of manipulation crumbling. The files, the evidence, and the master key were secured. The network's reach was exposed to the world. Yet, as Rebecca watched Carter disappear into custody, a final encrypted message appeared on her phone. "This is only the beginning. The mask can be worn by many. Stay vigilant." The rain had stopped. Dawn was breaking. Rebecca took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the battle behind her and the uncertain path ahead. Justice had won a battle, but the war against shadows and secrets would never truly end. And in the quiet moments before the sun rose, she understood one thing clearly. In this fight, trust was the rarest and most dangerous weapon of all. The dawn broke quietly over the city, soft light spilling into the corners of the room where Rebecca sat alone, her thoughts heavy but clear. The long, exhausting battle against the hidden network had culminated in Carter's arrest, a victory that felt both immense and fragile. The truth was finally out, exposed for the world to see, but the warning on her phone lingered like a shadow. This is only the beginning. The mask can be worn by many. Stay vigilant. Rebecca understood then that justice was rarely absolute. It was a moving target, a constant struggle against forces that hid beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to strike again. The network they had dismantled was just one branch of a sprawling web, and Carter was only one mask among many. She rose from the chair and walked to the window, watching as the city slowly stirred awake. People moved through the streets, oblivious to the battle that had been fought to protect them. Their lives went on, filled with ordinary worries and hopes, unaware of the invisible threats lurking in shadows. Her phone buzzed softly on the table. A message from Navarro. "What's next?" Rebecca hesitated before replying. She knew the fight wasn't over. It never would be. But for now, they had taken a crucial step toward truth and accountability. "We keep watching," she typed back. "We stay ready, and we make sure the light never goes out." The weight of those words felt like a promise to herself and to everyone who had suffered in silence. Later, Navarro joined her by the window, his expression thoughtful. You think they'll come back? Rebecca nodded slowly. They have to, but we'll be ready. They shared a quiet moment, the kind born from shared struggle and understanding. Neither could say what the future held, but both knew they would face it together. In the days that followed, the revelations sparked a firestorm. The media exploded with reports, the public demanding answers and reform. Investigations opened across multiple agencies. Some corrupt officials were removed, others resigned, but many questions remained. Rebecca spent hours sifting through the aftermath, following leads, supporting new witnesses who stepped forward. Each story was a thread, weaving a tapestry of pain and resilience. But even as the world turned its attention to the scandal, Rebecca knew the true challenge lay in the quiet moments, the vigilance needed to protect the fragile progress made. One evening, as she prepared to leave the office, her phone lit up with an unknown number. She answered cautiously. A voice spoke, calm and measured, yet unmistakably familiar. Congratulations, agent. You've done well. Rebecca's pulse quickened. Who is this? The voice paused. Someone who has been watching you all along. The masks are never truly removed. Before she could respond, the line went dead. The chilling reminder settled over her. The fight against shadows was endless, and the masks wore many faces. Rebecca locked her phone and stepped out into the night, the city lights glowing like distant stars. She was tired but determined, because in a world built on secrets, the greatest courage was to seek the truth, even when it meant facing the darkness alone. And so, the story continued. The city slowly returned to its usual rhythm as the dust settled on the storm they had weathered together. Rebecca sat quietly in the small, safe house, the morning sun filtering through the blinds, casting lines of light and shadow across the room. The files were safe, the network dismantled, and Carter behind bars. But the real victory was the truth finally being told. It had been a hard-fought battle against corruption, secrecy, and betrayal, but the story now belonged to the world. Her phone buzzed softly beside her, a message from Navarro. We did what we could. What now? She smiled faintly, feeling the exhaustion in her bones, yet a new sense of purpose filling her heart. Rebecca knew this was more than just a case closed. It was a reminder that vigilance was the price of freedom. The puppeteers of the past had been unmasked, but the fight to keep the truth alive would never end. She typed back, we keep watching. We keep fighting. She thought about the people who had suffered in silence, their lives touched and sometimes broken by the network's reach. Their voices, finally heard, gave meaning to the risks they had taken. The files they uncovered were more than just documents. They were stories of resilience, courage, and hope. Outside, the city buzzed with new energy. News outlets carried headlines about the scandal, and the public demanded reform. Officials once untouchable now faced investigations. Change was slow, but real. The shadows that had held power trembled in the light. Rebecca looked back at the sealed envelope Larson had given her, the master key to the network's darkest secrets. She had learned that trust was fragile, often hidden beneath layers of masks and deception. But she had also learned that honesty and determination could break those walls down. Navarro joined her, quiet but steady as always. You think it's truly over? She shook her head gently. No, but we've made a difference. That's all we can do. Keep the light shining. They sat together in the fading glow of morning, knowing their work was far from finished. The network's tendrils might stretch far, but the courage to face it had grown stronger. Weeks passed, and new leads appeared, small ripples that might become waves. New witnesses came forward, inspired by the courage of those who had spoken out. Each story added another piece to the puzzle. Rebecca stayed ready, her eyes open, her heart steady. She understood now that the horrors of corruption and secrecy were not just history. They were battles of the present and future. But with every truth uncovered, the world became a little safer, a little more just. In the quiet moments, she found strength in the human spirit, the ability to endure, to fight back, and to believe in something better. The storm had passed, but the sky was clear. And in that clarity, Rebecca saw hope. The story they had lived was one of shadows and light, of horrors faced and overcome. It was a story not just about the past, but about the future they all shared. And with that, Rebecca knew she would keep fighting no matter the cost. Because sometimes the greatest courage is simply refusing to be silent. The truth was out there, and so was the hope. The end.